Don't you know, we're talking about a revolution sounds.
Now you look at those years,
Don't you
1763,
know,
the end
talking
of the
about
French
a
Indian War,
revolution
to
sounds.
1776, when we actually declare our independence, right? So anyway, y'all, a question to ask is, was the American Revolution inevitable? I didn't put that on the notes, but do you think that today, let's say 200 years, 250 years later, is it possible that America could still be a colony of Great Britain? Think that's reasonable, logical? No. I mean, think about it. Britain is a small island. We have like 4, 5 times their population, right? It is kind of silly to think of a little island controlling a continent, and yet that's the way it was. Nevertheless, there might have been other ways that we could have gradually got our independence. Canada gets its independence in 1867, right? 90 years after we do. Australia comes a little bit later. Nevertheless, y'all, in 1914, when Britain goes to war, its colonies, or its former colonies, all go to war with it. And in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, the British Empire begins to be dismantled in a peaceful fashion, okay? But America's revolution is going to spark other revolutions. And this is a big key concept that AP wants you guys to know. They want you to understand that America's revolution inspired those in Mexico and Central America and South America. We even go so far as to call Simón Bolívar, right, the George Washington of Latin America, right? Because, he freed so many different countries as George Washington freed us, okay? But America's revolution also inspires revolutions that don't work out so well. What's one of them that starts in 1789, y'all? Come on, you know it. You gotta love the French Revolution, right? Guillotines, right? Beheading thousands of people, nuns being killed, legs being fired out of cannons. It was crazy. People went, crazy, y'all. It was awful. And the Russian Revolution and Civil War, millions dead. China's revolution, multiple millions of people dead. And of all those revolutions, y'all, with the possible exception of the Chinese, the only one that still has the same government, that still has the same constitution, USA. USA. Anyway, we're the only one that works. So in a lot of ways, y'all, the American Revolution is the most successful. I used to kind of argue with people in my more radical younger days, like, man, America, that's not a revolution. It didn't really change that much. It's a war for independence, and that's what some people like to call it. We weren't trying to flip the world and society upside down. We're just fighting to become an independent country. And yet, remember, y'all, we fought this war for over a year before we declared our independence. Shooting started in April of 1775. The Declaration of Independence was until June of 1776, a full year later, okay? So be aware of that kind of thing. I mean, I don't know. Maybe we could have gradually asserted ourselves and gotten independence, but for whatever reason, we chose not to. Now, the reason I'm going to be giving you guys that chart on Monday is so you guys can go through and see. It wasn't just one event. It was a series of events. And that's how we describe it in the Declaration. A series of events leading to our ultimate, and leading ultimately to tyranny over us, okay, is how we see it. Now, when I was a student, y'all, way back in the last millennium, when our teachers wanted to use technology, it was called a film strip projector. Y'all ever heard of film strip projectors? Yeah, teachers would have this little device in the middle of the room on a cart, and it would shine up one slide at a time. I mean, and it would have some narrator. And they weren't even, a lot of them weren't even automatic. They would have a beep, and that was the instruction to advance it to the next frame. And we all would fight for the right to be the dude who got to, can I change it? Can I advance it? And then you do it, I guess, just to keep yourself from falling asleep. Now, when the first videos started coming out for education, companies were pretty lazy. They took the old film strip projectors and they filmed them in video. And so we get something like this. So this is how I would have learned about the American Revolution had I not been living in Canada for my 8th grade year.
The war in Europe and America had left England with a huge national debt, and it was felt that the colonies should pay their fair share.
Beat.
King George III and his ministers devised a new system of taxation for the colonies, not only to pay for the war, but to make the colonies once more enrich the mother country.
Beat.
The war, however, had done much to develop the strength and resistance of the colonies, who had come to realize that their only real security and independence was in their unity and joint cooperation.
Beat. And so it would go on and on like that, y'all. Now, as I mentioned, y'all, it depends, your words for describing this. Was this a revolution that turned the country upside down, fundamentally changed who has power, changed everything like that? Or was this merely a war for independence or a war of independence? The name that you select, maybe it's unconscious, but think about it, right? What am I saying about the revolution or about the war for independence by the name I choose? To me, it's just a breakup. And as Neil Sedaka can tell us here, breaking up is hard to do. Yep, breaking up is hard to do, as Americans would find out. So why were the colonists so upset, as it says up there? Well, until the end of the French Indian War, y'all, colonists had their own assemblies, and they would still have their own assemblies, but it had been the responsibility of those assemblies, y'all, to come up with their own taxes. They had been sort of in charge of things, just like you guys, want to have more right to say what you do at home and that kind of thing like that. You don't like decisions all being made for you. And so we had kind of made our own. We were kind of playing the role of like a grown-up, right? But then, because of the debt of the French Indian War and then Pontiac's Rebellion, the British expected us to pick up the slack. And they told us, rather than ask us to come up with the money, they told us how they were going to generate the money, and it would be through a series of taxes that we had no right in making. And the reason we had no right in making these taxes, y'all, was because we did not have a single member in Parliament, what you call MPs, members of Parliament. No American could do that. And I'll talk about virtual representation in just a sec here, y'all. But here's a picture of all all the American representatives in the House of Commons. Can y'all see them? There aren't any, right? Not one person from these British colonies was represented in Parliament. Instead, y'all, the British responded that Americans were virtually represented. This idea of virtual representation. In other words, I may not be an American, but it doesn't mean I can't, vote for things and think of Americans' interests when I make my choices. It's like saying, just because I'm a white dude living in this area, that I don't know what black people in Chicago need, okay? Seems kind of silly to think that, but yeah, that's what the British were doing. I'm some dude in England, but I know what's best for Americans 3,000 miles away. You and I laugh at that argument today, and we laughed at it then. William Pitt, who you guys heard about, was out of power, and Pitt thought this was the stupidest idea he'd ever heard. He thought it was insulting to try to tell Americans they were virtually represented. Now, of course, what does this lead to? It leads to claims like this: no taxation without representation. Now, I looked online, y'all, trying to find a virtual representative, and I eventually found one here for y'all. Here you go. That's a virtual representative. Get it? He's got like virtual reality goggles on. Yeah, I'll be here all week. All right. Anyway, y'all. Now, for more than half of our country's history, y'all, until 1920 and the 19th Amendment, half of our people were virtually represented. Who am I talking about? Come on, 50% of our population, and it's not men, women. Women weren't represented. Instead, men said, look, little lady, I can represent you. I know what's best for you. You don't want to get your hands into dirty politics. I'll just represent you. Native Americans weren't represented. In a lot of ways, African Americans weren't represented until the 1960s, right? And even today, there's a large group of people still not represented. And we have about 8 or 9 of them in this classroom. Who are they? Y'all, right? Teenagers. Now, I'm not advocating for 5th graders being in Congress, although they might be smarter than some of the people we have there now. But in a way, we still depend on virtual representation. Congress doesn't necessarily look like us. We don't see necessarily young people. We see a lot of older people, right? And it's kind of, I think it's unfortunate, both for Democrats and Republicans, that so many of their leaders are old dudes. They need some new blood, right? Now, in 1760, during the French Indian War, King George II did the decent thing and finally died, okay? And he took power. His wife was still alive, and her young son came to power. He was 22. That's 5 years older than a lot of y'all in this classroom. Imagine, y'all are 22 years old, and you now have the power over the greatest empire in the world. Would that be kind of a lot? Yeah, that'd be kind of hard to deal with. And the thing is, this is King George III, and here's a closer up picture of him, like the one I have on your notes. We have really villainized this guy. And I'm not saying I feel sorry for him, but I do think we've done a certain injustice to him. We portrayed him as an absolute, like, tyrant, like a dictator. If he had a fault, it was probably that he was too easily pushed in directions by his friends and by his ministers. He could be manipulated. Now, ultimately, he did go crazy, but that was long after the revolution. You know, if you remember when I was on Jeopardy, they had a question about George III, because he's still around, y'all, for the War of 1812, right? What, 35, 45 years after the revolution? He is still around for that, but he's absolutely out of it, okay? He has a disease that we know what it is now. Get this, y'all, his urine was purple. I guess we could call it purine. Oh, anyway. Okay, yeah. All right, we'll go on here. Imagine being the guy who had to document the king's urine and doo-doo. Yeah. Yep. Okay, so Whigs and the king's men. Whigs and the king's men. Yeah. The king, y'all, was a threat to Whigs. Now, why is it important to know what a Whig is? Later, America will have our own Whig party, y'all, that will elect 2 presidents, have one very powerful representative by the name of Henry Clay as well, too. But Whigs, y'all, were a faction. They weren't yet a political party. A faction is a word y'all need to know. It's like a temporary political alliance. James Madison will write a lot about them in the Federalist Papers. He was very, very nervous that they would tear our country apart. Some people would agree with him that today, in a lot of ways, we have a lot of factions, people pulling us in all kinds of different directions. Now, the Whigs were this faction, and they were very, very nervous about George III and this power. And they were just fearful about power. Now, those ideas will make their way to our founding fathers, whether it's Thomas Jefferson, Ben Franklin, George Washington, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, y'all. All of those guys, y'all, were terrified of too much power being in the hands of too few people. When they write, first of all, the Articles of Confederation, they will make it deliberately a very weak document. I used to wonder, why was the Articles so weak? Were they stupid? No, they were just afraid. After, defeating one dictator as they saw him, they didn't want to replace him with several dictators, right? Now, they thought George III was corrupt, that he had been corrupt. Maybe he was a decent guy, but he had been pushed around by a lot of his ministers and the so-called king's men, that is, the friends of the king. His power was too arbitrary. It was just too random, right, to let this guy have all this power. Now, Lord North was probably more the problem than George III. Here's Lord North, right? And he was one of the men in charge of the king's men who really was very, very influential on what the king wanted. Now, I skipped one of the questions that I had on there. George III's mom had said that he needed to reign, as in REIGN, as well as, rule as well as reign. To rule as well as reign. She didn't want him just to be a figurehead, letting Parliament do everything and just sit by and wearing the crown. She wanted him to put his foot down, assert himself. And indeed he will, y'all. But in American minds, he becomes like the new stepdad that's going to be making all kinds of new rules in the house. And it's going to be just kind of natural that you and I rebel against that kind of treatment. Now, this is the most famous quote that I know of from a Whig. And it's one that you guys would do well to memorize. You could use this in essays on the Constitution, in essays on the Articles of Confederation, for the Revolution, or whatever. Americans agreed with Lord Acton, an English Whig, that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. If you give a person complete power, they are going to be completely and utterly corrupt. Having that kind of thing, it's just natural. So the only way to fight this is to diminish power, or at least to distribute power. And that's why we're going to have a president who has certain powers. We're going to have a Congress with certain powers, a constitution with certain powers, and we're going to give the states their own powers. We're going to set up sort of this competition. As Madison will say, ambition will be made to counter ambition. And so we owe a lot, y'all, to the Whig political faction. And in fact, they supported us in the Revolution. We tend to think that this war was America versus the British. It was American Whigs and patriots versus American loyalists and British Tories. That's how this war really came down to it, y'all. All right, so why were the colonists so afraid of a small tax? And this tax was fairly small, y'all. It was only, a percent or two, this first tax that they passed, a sugar tax. Well, I think it can be tied up to something that people call the slippery slope argument. The slippery slope argument. Has anybody ever heard of that? That it's a slippery slope you're on. What does that mean? Yeah, it means it could escalate really quickly. You need to be careful because a couple little steps and boom, you go down the whole slope. Now, some people call it a fallacy. They call it the slippery slope fallacy. But I'll give you an example of a slippery slope argument. And this is true. This is literally what was said to me as a kid. In third grade, I was living in Puerto Rico, right, with my mom and dad. And my dad, I said to him one day, Christmas was coming up, and I said, Dad, can you get me a guitar, right? Or can Santa bring me a guitar? My dad looked at me, and he thought a little bit, and he goes, Son, I got a guitar for your brother once. He started playing guitar. He joined a band. Some of the guys in the band weren't too good. They started drinking. Then they started doing drugs. And now your brother's a drug addict because he played guitar. Now, does that seem like kind of a stretch to y'all? Well, I don't know. It seemed to me kind of silly at the time, a little 8-year-old or whatever, 9-year-old kid. But he went ahead and got me the guitar. But I never learned to play it. You know why? I was afraid of becoming a drug. So, a great, great artist, y'all, I just want you to know that, was probably lost to the world because of that slippery slope argument. So, what is a slippery slope? This is a long explanation, but it basically comes down to this. A small event is used to suggest that it led to a bigger event, which leads to an even bigger event, which leads to some ultimate catastrophe, right? One thing leads to another thing, leads to another thing, and then finally, boom, it's bad. So understand that kind of idea. So this was what the colonists were afraid of about the British. To you and me, a little tax doesn't seem like a big deal. But I'm going to give you a quote now from the graphic novel packet that I gave you guys. This is from good old Sam Adams, right? Here's Sam Adams, got a bobblehead of him, all right? Sam Adams said, if our trade may be taxed, why not our lands? Why not the produce of our land and everything we make use of? If taxes are laid on us in any shape without our having a legal representative where they are laid, are we not reduced from the character of free subjects to the miserable state of tributary slaves? So in other words, y'all, we go from a couple cent tax to being slaves. It's kind of a big jump, right? But in their mind, and I gotta say, with what turns out to be some justification, indeed, this is kind of what they began to see. If we give in to them on this tax, next time it's going to be a bigger tax. And taxing means taking away our property. And if they can take away our property, they can take away our liberty. They can take away our liberty, they can take away our life. And boy, does this escalate quickly. And I got to say, the British don't play it well. The British do take away their right to a trial by jury. The British take away their rights to having assemblies, like by shutting down the Massachusetts Assembly. They closed the port of Boston. If you're colonial, you're looking like, yep, we accepted the tax, and look what happened. We became drug addicts. We became slaves to the British, okay? So like I said, this is called the slippery slope argument, and that's how Americans really kind of viewed. If they let the British get away with this, it was a slippery slope. It could ultimately lead to them not having the liberty. That's the Beatles talking about it. So the British all were tired, like they were, of paying high taxes. Somebody would have to pay these taxes that weren't British. Who? Those ungrateful colonists. Lord Grenville, George Grenville, the new prime minister, he said, look, they need to pay their fair share. We fought a war to free them from the French, from the Indians. But the whole time they smuggled goods. They're still smuggling, to avoid paying duties. So this is kind of how the British were viewing it. So the Brits are going to come up with a series of new taxes. Now, mercantilism, y'all. The British are going to pass a series of laws called the Navigation. I'll just make sure I'm sharing the right screen. There we go. Should be okay and happy now. All righty, y'all. So, did we get to talk about mercantilism or the taxes and play taxman or anything? Did we get that far? No, we did not. Okay. Just trying to find where we got in here. Did we talk about the slippery slope argument? Did we get that far?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so remember, y'all, to us it might seem kind of weird that Americans, our colonists, were worried about a small tax. But in their mind, the small tax constituted a slippery slope. If you let the British pass this tax without allowing representation of Americans in Parliament, the British are going to take it further and further. And as we said, Sam Adams is going to take it all the way from, they're limiting our trade, and suddenly we wake up one morning and we're slaves. Okay, now, so the big problem that the British faced would be whether, how to pay for all of these new revenues. And what they chose to do, the debt had doubled. And so who's going to pay for the war? Who's going to pay for the soldiers who are over here to keep the Indians and the colonials from fighting? Who's going to pay for all that? Well, here we hear the Beatles to that. It's 1/4/19. Now, nobody, including the Beatles, liked the taxman, right? As the Beatles became wealthier and wealthier, they saw more and more of their income disappearing, right? And they would have become what we call tax exiles. John Lennon did move over here ultimately, but you see other rock stars who do that. They flee away from those high taxes. Now, King George, you see here saying, look, the cost of beating the French has doubled our national debt, which was true. Who's going to pay it? Englishmen were already overtaxed in his mind at 20%. And remember, Englishmen could vote for people in Parliament. Americans couldn't. Now, George Grenville, who was prime minister for part of this period, he argues that it's the colonists who should do this. And remember, y'all, we talked a lot about how the French-Indian War caused some really bad feelings between the two, okay? See if can I get rid of this stupid thing here? Yes, hopefully. Hide myself. Okay, they had, the colonists had already had to pay, they had already smuggled a lot. They didn't like this war. The British thought they fought this war for us, and we just were ungrateful. So they thought in their mind it was fair for Americans to do it. So the Brits are going to come up with some taxes. Now, the page that was given to you guys is going to have a series of laws. Now, one of these laws that's on your chart is called the Navigation Acts. Notice I did not put a date on the Navigation Acts because there's quite a few of these and they occur over a lot of years. Now, the Navigation Acts were relatively accepted by the colonists because they weren't necessarily about generating money. They were more about regulating trade, which, the colonists didn't like, but hey. Now, on the paper that I gave you on the notes, one of the questions I asked towards the bottom is, why did the colonists not oppose the Navigation Acts earlier? Well, think about it, y'all. I know this today. You guys were given these badges, right? You and I don't like badges. I hate them, but sadly, as part of our safety, this is something that's happening in most businesses you guys will work for, have these kind of things. Now, what if they didn't enforce these at all? No one ever got in trouble. Or if you did get caught not having your ID badge, nobody did anything about it. Would it really bug you that we had rules about badges? No, because it's not being enforced. Now, if on the other hand, every time a teacher saw you without an ID badge, you got written up for like Saturday detention, well, man, suddenly the badge issue would become a thing. So the main reason we colonists were not too upset about the Navigation Acts is they weren't really very enforced. And if indeed you did get caught, what we tended to do was we ignored these laws. We just ignored them, like a lot of students ignored, wearing ID badges, or will ignore, all right? Another thing, by the way, the Navigation Acts did is, remember, they're part of mercantilism. What is mercantilism? It's this idea that you want to keep the gold and silver in the mother country. You want to maximize your exports, minimize your imports. In other words, you want people sending gold and silver to you without you having to send much of that gold and silver back out to them. You want to maximize your gold, all right? So one of the things was, if they weren't going to trade with the British, they still had to go through Britain. So let's say I want to sell stuff to France. I have to use British ships and British crews, which fortunately included Americans in those days. But I would have to stop in Britain. Britain would tax the items on there, so they would get a chunk of that money, and then I could take it on to France. In a way, it's kind of like saying who your friends and girlfriends can be, and we did not like that. So at first, we ignored these laws, and we smuggled. Now, let's say if you got caught smuggling, maybe you're bringing in Dutch tea, and you're not paying any fees. You're not going through Britain with the Dutch tea. What would happen is you would pay off an official. You would give him or her some either money or give them the goods, and that person would let you bring it ashore. Now, in the rare chance that perhaps you actually got caught and the official couldn't be bribed and it went to trial, guess what? The jury was willing to usually let you off. Remember, a jury is a jury of your peers. It's a very, very important tradition that we have going back to 1215 to the Magna Carta. So even then, it was old. So you paid off officials. The juries went easy on you. So to be honest, it wasn't that big a deal. All right. Now, John Hancock, shown here, became rich by smuggling. In fact, he was one of the richest people, if not the richest, in the colonies. Later famous for what? Where does that signature come from, y'all? Declaration of Independence. Remember, his signature is like 3 or 4 times as big as everybody else's because he said he wanted the king to be able to read it without his spectacles. So this is a guy who made his money smuggling. Now, I'm not talking about smuggling drugs or something bad. I'm talking about like smuggling tea or cloth or things like that they didn't want to go through Britain and have to pay the taxes. So he's a smuggler. There we go. All right. Now, on your chart, y'all, the first act that we have a date for and one that you need to know is called the Sugar Act. Now, in truth, there had already been Sugar and Molasses Acts passed, but like the Navigation Acts, they had not been that enforced. And so the colonists didn't really mind. But things changed with the 1764 Sugar Act on sugar and molasses. Now, today, there's all kinds of sugar substitutes. Today, most of us don't use molasses very much. But in those days, y'all, molasses was a key component of making rum, right? And rum was one of the most popular adult beverages they had at the time. So what this tax did is if I'm trying to bring in sugar or I'm trying to bring in molasses into the colonies, I'm going to be charged a tax before I bring it ashore. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pass that tax on in the form of a higher price when I sell it. So when you and I buy that good, either sugar or we buy rum or whatever, or maybe molasses, we're going to notice the price is higher. But we're not going to see directly that it's a tax. This is what's known as an indirect tax. Now, when I lived in Canada as a kid, one of the many places we lived, I thought it was kind of interesting because prices in Canada, at least when I lived there, the price you saw was the price. It wasn't the price plus tax. You guys know how it is here. If something's $5 and you put $5 on the table, they're going to look at you kind of strange and say, it's 41 more cents for tax and that kind of thing. But the tax was kind of hidden in it in the form of a higher price. You and I see this today. You guys hopefully aren't buying cigarettes or alcohol, but alcohol and cigarettes are much more expensive than they should be. Why? Because we tax the heck out of them. I'm not saying I disagree. I don't like either product, but I'm just saying the fact that we tax those things because we know we can. You can raise the tax on cigarettes. Are people still going to buy them? Yeah. You can raise the tax on alcohol. Are people still going to buy it? Yeah. Now, you have to be careful. If you raise it too high, people are going to start smuggling it, making it illegally or whatever. So it's a fine kind of line that we've learned. But in most things in the United States, y'all, when you and I buy it, they tell us the price, and then the tax is extra. It is a direct tax. This is what we call indirect. Now, that is definitely an economic reason for the revolution. People don't like paying taxes, but there's more to it than just the extra few cents on sugar and on booze. One of the problems is now the British would enforce this, and if you got caught doing this, y'all, you went not to a court with the jury of your peers, but an admiralty court. Now, an admiralty court had British judges who were paid by the British Crown. In other words, we had no control over these people. Also, because they weren't a jury of our peers who tended to be friendlier to us, often letting us off, maybe they were even our customers, we did not have that anymore. And more people began getting arrested for smuggling and going to jail for smuggling. They even started setting up sort of a rat line where you could let an official know that somebody was a smuggler, and you could actually get, some money or even part of the stuff they were smuggling in as payment for ratting somebody out. Now, so what was the colonial reaction to it? Well, protest, right? But nothing like would come would come the very next year. But we do have a famous phrase that comes out of this, and it is taxation without representation is tyranny. You guys will see that and hear that ad nauseum. Taxation without representation is tyranny. And of course, as this other gentleman is saying, so are trials without jury. So remember, y'all, this revolution, yeah, it's about economics, but it's also about political rights. One of our sacred rights is going to be trials by jury. And even in the Declaration, when we're listing what we call our grievances, we make a big point in saying that the government has, in some cases, deprived us of our right to trial by juries. It's a sacred right, y'all. It is in our Constitution's Bill of Rights today. So many things, y'all, when we write our Constitution, they are a direct response to what we viewed as tyrannical actions on the part of the federal.
Our sugar, there's nothing sugar. All they could see.
Actually lower the tax that had been on sugar already, but they started enforcing it more. Man, wasn't that awesome? You'll never forget the sugar tax. Now we come to the Currency Act, and I can't make this 5-pound note go away. Now, paper money, y'all, just kind of curious. Y'all think paper money is much longer for the world? I mean, y'all ever turn down when somebody offers you paper money like, hey, man, I don't take that anymore? Y'all, like if I offered y'all a $100 bill, would you turn it away? No, right? But have you guys noticed that there are some places now that don't take cash? Like when I go to AMC over here and I try to give them cash, they're like, oh, no. It's got to be credit card. I guess they don't want to handle dirty bills because, bills have all kinds of germs or something on them. It's kind of weird. But, more and more, we're going digital, right? Now, paper money took a long time before people got used to it. What did people use before paper money? Coins. Now, today, if I offered you a bunch of coins, you might take it, but you wouldn't be really happy, right? It's heavy and all of that. And to be honest, our coins today don't have a whole lot of intrinsic worth. In other words, you could melt down a quarter, and I don't know how much silver you're going to get out of it, if any, right? But back in the day, coins were gold. They were silver. They were copper. They had value. And of course, the British wanted them. Remember, mercantilism was all about getting as much gold and silver as you could and keeping it. Now, the colonists pretty much were required through the Navigation Acts to buy British. They would sell their stuff to the British, and then the British would buy stuff or would sell them manufactured goods. But the trouble is, y'all, it was kind of one-sided. The colonists were buying a lot more stuff from the British than the British were buying back from the colonists. So it wasn't like we send over 1,000 pounds and they buy 1,000 pounds back. There was a real trade deficit is the term that we would use today. We're buying a lot more from them than they're from us. Kind of like what China is today, right? We buy a lot more from China than China buys from us. So colonists began, y'all, to start running out of money. So kind of understand the background to the British law, the Currency Act. And this definitely is an economic cause. Colonists were buying a lot more from the British than vice versa. And like you see one of the coins back from the day, they weren't really nice like our coins today. They were pretty rough, right? So what this starts to do is it leads to a coin currency shortage. Okay, we begin to run out of specie, people call it. There's a shortage of gold and silver out there. And so the colonists, y'all, begin the practice of printing paper money, a lot of paper money. Now, you and I today, we're not nervous about paper money. We're used to it. People, especially businesses, were very nervous about paper money. In this case, this is issued by the Virginia James River Bank. It is number 52 out of 5,193 notes done. They literally wrote that on it, y'all, and each note was signed by the banker and the treasurer. Imagine what that was like. The British, y'all, they didn't like this money being printed. And sure as you know what, they did not want to accept paper money. And another thing the colonists were doing that's going to tick off the British all is it was fairly easy to declare bankruptcy. Now, bankruptcy can be personal. You got so many credit card bills, there's just no way you're going to be able to pay it. So what happens? Well, you might lose your house, your home, your house, your car, whatever. And then they would sell that, and then they would pay off your creditors, and then you have to start all over again. If you're a business, they take what they call your assets. So let's say Mr. D has been opening up his Italican fusion restaurant, Italian food mixed with Mexican food, right? And man, I get about $1 million in debt, paying workers and paying, for all the ingredients, and I just don't have much money at all. And finally, I have to declare bankruptcy. Well, they'll look and they'll say, well, you got about $100,000 in equipment here at your restaurant, maybe the building or whatever. We're going to take that, and then we'll pay off your creditors, maybe 10 cents on the dollar. So if I owe some dude $10,000, he might get $1,000, and then I'm free, right? The guy doesn't get his money, but I'm free, and maybe in the future sometime I can try to have another business or something. Well, the colonists, y'all, were declaring bankruptcy way too much for the British. So the British respond to our printing of money, right? We've got lots of printed money there. The British respond, y'all, by passing this law that keeps the colonies from printing money. Sorry, this 5-pound note is blocking that. But the Currency Act forbid the colonists from printing money, paper money, and it also, y'all, tightened the bankruptcy law. It wasn't as easy to declare bankruptcy and write off your debts, mainly to the British, and leave them holding the bag. So this is definitely an economic thing. And you can kind of understand where the British are coming from, but at the same time, the Americans got to have money to buy and sell and trade stuff with each other. So it's a Currency Act. Probably not asked a whole lot on the AP test, but if you want an economic reason for the revolution, you could point this one out. British didn't let us print money. They tightened bankruptcy laws. We were not happy about that at all. Now, the next thing that comes is the Stamp Act. Now, if you guys remember anything in May when you take your AP test, you need to remember the Stamp Act. It is by far, until the Coercive Acts, the worst of the British actions. 1765, the Stamp Act. Now, what it did was it required all publications, all official documents, y'all, to actually have a stamp that you had to buy for. So you tick off newspaper publishers because every newspaper, y'all, had to have a stamp added to it, and you paid for that stamp. Every official document, you get married, you get divorced, you graduate from school, even playing cards, y'all, had to have that on dice that you bought, had to have a stamp of some sort. They tried to get it everybody. Now, what's different about this than the sugar tax is this is a direct tax. In other words, you know the price of something you're buying, but then boom, here's an extra 2 cents for the tax. And this angered Americans. Now, the British couldn't understand why the Americans were upset. The British already had a stamp tax on their own citizens, so they didn't think Americans would mind. But the difference is British citizens had the right to elect and send their own people to Parliament. We couldn't do that. So this was not a tax that we had created. It was a tax imposed on us. Now, we had friends in Parliament. One of them was a guy by the name of Isaac Barr, or Barre. I'm not sure how you pronounce that. But anyway, he comes up with this quote, and Americans will definitely embrace part of this. He says, Americans are sons of liberty, and they won't surrender their rights without a fight. And as it says, he proved to be very right. So the Stamp Act, y'all, there are going to be several colonial actions you guys need to know. One of the first things that will come up, y'all, come back to that, is sorry about that, y'all, is going to be the Stamp Act Congress. Now, the Stamp Act Congress is going to be where the colonists will send representatives to New York, just as they had done to try to come up with the Albany Plan at the Albany Congress. But remember, that was to try to keep the Indians neutral, or at least the Iroquois neutral, or even on our side, and to kind of come up with some common defense. This was purely, y'all, trying to come up with a solution to fight this tax. Later, we'll have a Continental Congress and a Second Continental Congress. But this is the first of the pre-revolutionary Congresses. And like I said, in some way kind of modeled on the Albany Plan or Albany Congress, but this was a big deal. So how are they going to fight this tax? They are going to boycott all British goods. They're going to list things and say, we're not going to buy these. They're going to hit the British in the pocketbook. Virginia also writes what are known as the Virginia Resolves. We hear for the first time a man's name by the name of Patrick Henry. Patrick Henry is a real firebrand, man. He has fire like coming out of his mouth when he talks, and he even threatens the king, y'all. He says, let King George remember the fate of Caesar and Charles I. But what happened to Caesar, y'all? What happened to Julius Caesar, y'all, man? Ides of March? Psycho? He got stabbed multiple times in the Senate, including one by one of his best friends, Brutus. Charles I had his head cut off by the British. British don't tend to cut off heads of their kings, y'all. They've only done it once. So he's basically saying, King George, remember what happened to Caesar. Remember what happened to Charles I. You could be next if you keep doing this. Pretty strong words. Now, I want to go back here, though, and talk about the Sons of Liberty. Now, on your handout, I ask about the Sons of Liberty as well as the Daughters of Liberty. AP loves to ask y'all about the role women play in historical events. How did this impact them? What role did they play? Now, the Sons of Liberty obviously were men. They resisted sometimes peacefully by writing pamphlets, okay, by distributing, signs and putting signs up opposing the British and this tax. But they also used some pretty strong intimidation. And to me, it's more than intimidation. It almost verges on terrorism. Now, so we see a stamp seller here. He sells the stamps that you have to put on your legal documents. Notice one guy is holding a bucket of tar. One is holding feathers. The threat is, of course, tarring and feathering. Now, the Daughters of Liberty, y'all, these were women who also supported punishing the British for the Stamp Act. Now, rather than using violence, they chose to use boycotts and somewhat more like peer pressure. Women might get together and spin cloth, make their own cloth so they wouldn't be buying it from the British. They might even have what were called sewing or quilting or spinning bees, where they would get together, bunches of them, and make their own cloth and maybe share with each other and that kind of thing. So that's an important role that they played. Now, also, what women sometimes did, I've heard, is they were sort of the enforcers of the boycott. Since women tended to be more often the people that did the shopping, they would intimidate, just as women might, maybe not by violence, but by shunning people or shaming other women who would not participate. Like, why are you buying that British cloth? You shouldn't be buying that British cloth. And things like that. So this was ways that they went about it. Now, I'm going to kind of jump ahead a little bit here. We talked about the Stamp Act Congress. Now let's come to the Sons of Liberty. Now, the leaders of the Sons of Liberty was this guy, right? This is Samuel Adams, who I have as a bobblehead here, although he's a lot skinnier than I remember him. But anyway, Samuel Adams, y'all, had been a maltster. That is a guy who makes the malt that from the barley that is used to make beer. You hear people claiming today, mainly the people that make Sam Adams beer, that he was a brewer. I've heard different things. Doesn't really matter. But the Sons of Liberty were led by him. More about his picture. I'm going to come up to the two pictures on your handout. Now, the tactics they used, one of the common things might be to find a tax collector and pour things down their throat. Now, this wasn't meant to kill you, but it sure as heck made you uncomfortable. They might basically put castor oil in your throat. Now, my grandma, old school. She'd been born in 1898. When people would get sick, her solution, and she used it once on me, was to give me castor oil. Now, when you get castor oil in large enough amounts, it can kill you, but a little bit will make you start, well, going to the bathroom, let's say. And the idea was it's supposed to, clean you out, make you feel better. I learned after that, don't ever tell grandma you're sick. I'm perfectly fine. So they're pouring castor oil down this guy's throat. Another thing they might do is if you're an official for the government, they might find and sack your home. By sacking it, they go in, they trash it, they tear it down, they steal your stuff. Well, I don't know about stealing it, but they wreck all the stuff that you have. But perhaps one of the most common, and one of the things you guys have heard the most, is what's called tarring and feathering. Tarring and feathering. Now, the way this works basically, y'all, is the tax official would be caught. They would tear your clothes off or take your clothes off. So you were standing in front of the crowd butt naked. Then they had tar, right? Really, really thick, hot, gooey tar. It's like asphalt kind of stuff. They would pour that on you. Then those people had access to feathers all over. They used feathers for their sheets or for their bed, for their pillows and stuff. They would then pour feathers all onto you. So that's how you were tarred and feathered. If you look at this picture here close up, you can see the guy has already been tarred and feathered. And as if that's not enough, if you look back behind him, you see a noose. They're literally threatening y'all to hang this dude. The Stamp Act itself is turned upside down, and they're going to hang him from the old Liberty Tree. Now, as I've mentioned, the Daughters of Liberty. This is from the TV show John Adams and the series a few years ago. You see them putting feathers on their ears and tar. Now the tar, y'all, can cause some pretty bad burns on your body. It's somewhat hard to breathe with your pores all closed. They put him on a rail, and they're going to take him out of town and drop him off here. Now, when the tar dried and cooled, you could peel it off, but guess what it also took off? Hair and maybe skin. And then you were butt naked out in the middle of nowhere. Obviously, if this happened to you, you were very unlikely to want to be a tax collector. Pretty violent means, and as you can see, John Adams, who would become a big favor of independence, he's sort of the father of independence, he's not real happy with that. To him, that's going too far. There are political ways. There are economic ways that don't use violence. And this is going to be sort of something that you have going on. You've got these more radical types, and then you have these more kind of, less violent types trying to do things. So women, like I said, made homespun, their own homemade cloth. You would definitely want to bring that up if AP asked you about women in the revolution or before the revolution. And, they continue to do that during the revolution, right? Because during the revolution, the British obviously weren't selling us stuff anymore. Trade with Britain drops to zero during the revolution. Spinning bees, sewing bees, quilting bees, women making their own cloth, making their own clothes in groups, and that kind of thing. So anyway, y'all, the Sons of Liberty, that was one of the things that they did. Now, the next thing I want to talk about here, y'all, are what are called writs of assistance. Writs of assistance. It's like right without the E, and it's assistance. Now, writs of assistance. You don't need to write all of this, but do write the part here. A writ of assistance. What is it? It's a general search warrant that allowed British officials to search. And so today, y'all, hopefully this never happens. Knock on wood, it hasn't happened to me yet. But if the cops show up at your house and say, let us in, we're here to look for whatever, do you have to let them in? Legally. You know, you might be terrified. Do you have to let them in? No. What do they have to have? They have to have a warrant. What does the warrant have to have on it? Your name, the date, your address, and specifically what they're looking for. They can't just write like illegal stuff. You know, why do we have that? Because of our experience with writs of assistance. A writ of assistance, y'all, could be given to an entire neighborhood. A British judge might go ahead and write it out, and it allowed the British to come to a neighborhood and to search any house they wanted, and they didn't even have to list what they were looking for. It was a general search warrant. And of course, that is appalling today. Now, admittedly, you guys know, if any of you are driving or you're riding around with friends, as a teenager, if you get stopped, what are they likely to do with your vehicle? Search it, right? Happened to me when I was a teenager. This probably happened to you or some of your friends. For whatever reason, and I don't quite understand the legality, it seems like you have less right to say no to a car. Now, what if cops come to your house and there's a dead body on the porch? Can the cops just ignore that and say, okay, we can't do anything, we don't have a warrant? No. If they have probable cause, if they hear somebody screaming, help me, that crazy AP teacher is going to kill me, then they have a right to come on in because they probable cause that there is something there to let them in. But they can't just, oh, well, let's just go on in and see what's there. And even ever since the 1960s, let's say, even with good faith, a cop decides, hey, I think this person's guilty. I'm going to put a little listening device or a video camera in their house without them knowing it. And I'm going to record their crimes happening. Can that be used in court against them? Nope. You cannot use evidence obtained illegally. Okay? Doesn't matter. The cops have to find some way to get you legally. They can't use illegal things. Supposedly, you and I know there are exceptions and bad stuff sometimes happens. But America, y'all, our Third Amendment, search and seizure, is a direct response to our experiences under the British. Now, the man who thought most about the writs of assistance was James Otis. He was an incredible writer and an incredible lawyer. John Adams said he saw him speaking once, and it was, as he said, as if the man were on fire, his ability. So instead of, that girl is on fire, I guess it could be, that lawyer is on fire. But anyway, y'all, and he comes up with the phrase that people still use today in the legal profession. A man's house, or I guess we could say a woman's house as well now, is his or her castle. You may not think much of it, but they have the right to defend it as a castle would be defended. Unless you have legal means. You got to have a warrant. It's got to list specifically what they're looking for. It's got to be signed by a judge for them to be able to do this, okay? He also came up with another phrase that you guys have already heard a couple times today. Taxation without representation is tyranny. So two very famous phrases, y'all, that people still use today when protesting, right? You know, defending their homes from illegal search and seizure, or when protesting, and I've got two T's in representation, sorry about that. Taxation without representation is tyranny. So, these are James Otis's words for it. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the Sons of Liberty here. Now, in this picture here, we see a painting that's actually on my, it's part of Academic Decathlon this year. It's one of the pieces of art that we have to study. Now, this is a painting of probably the most famous member of the Sons of Liberty, and this is Paul Revere. Now, you and I know Paul Revere from his midnight ride, warning people about the British soldiers coming. But that was one night in his life. What did he do the other several thousand nights? Well, he worked as an engraver and as a silversmith. That was his job. In fact, if you can ever find any real Revere ware, real Revere silver, it is worth a fortune. Now, this painting was done by one of America's greatest painters, and I've seen the original. The original's a little bit smaller, if I remember right, but this is an interesting painting because most painters, y'all, only painted the wealthy, people who could afford to hire them to do it. But this is a painting of a craftsman. He's wearing simple clothes here. He's got his work vest on. And it's almost as if we've interrupted him. He's looking directly at us. In his hand, he's holding a silver tea kettle that probably he made. Now, it hasn't been engraved yet. It doesn't have any engraving. But if we look, what's here on the table that also shows his reflection, I tell y'all, one of the coolest things seeing this painting was to come up close to it and see how he'd been able to paint the reflection on this polished table. But also, here are his engraving tools. So it's like we caught the dude in the middle of his job. And this is the only painting we really have of Paul Revere, who was really not that famous in his lifetime, but would later become famous, of course, for the Midnight Ride and when they wrote the poem about it. Now, so I was up in Boston, where I went to see this painting and lots of other cool paintings there. And I'm like, man, it seems like I've seen that picture of Paul Revere on some bottle or something. What could it, oh my gosh, it's on there. But of course the deal is, y'all, is that Paul Revere? Is that Sam Adams? Is it Paul Revere? Or is it Jack Black? Did you see that? Is it Paul Revere or is it Jack Black? I'll see. I'll let you. Alrighty, y'all. So on my tie today is, of course, a picture, one of the most famous pictures William Strickland and I, of the Boston Massacre, right? The Boston Massacre of March 5th. Now, if you guys remember, there had been violence against stamp collectors. We saw tarring and feathering yesterday. They even sacked a couple people's homes and things like that. So the king decides that he needs to send troops to Boston to control. We mentioned that there was only 16,000 Bostonians, and then they added 4,000 soldiers. And how you guys would feel if you had 1 out of every 5 students roaming around. Of course, it might stop some of the fights or not. I don't know. But anyway, so what ends up happening here is, so the British send troops in 1768. So the British action here, and I don't know what's up with all that stuff. But anyway, so we come to the Boston Massacre of 1770, right? This is incredibly important, but most Americans don't understand it, okay? They don't understand what happened. Now, up north, y'all, there's this weird phenomenon. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of it, but it's called, I believe, snow. Frozen precipitation. And, you know, we get it here, and it's kind of cute and all that. We make little, you know, snowmen about that tall or whatever. But when they get it up there, I mean, it can get thick. And it can be on the ground even in March. And by March, it's freezing, it's melting, it's freezing. It gets mixed up with all the dirt and stuff on there. And I don't know if you've ever been hit with, I mean, I know you guys probably throw snowballs. Have y'all ever thrown like the ice balls? They are painful. I got hit with one in the face in Canada. I mean, it actually broke the skin as a kid. And so they can be pretty serious. Now, that's going to be part of the story coming up here later. Now, I'm going to go through the events, and then I have some incredible, rare historical footage for you guys to see of it. Early GoPro footage of the Boston Massacre. Now, so how did it kind of go down? A quick summary, and then you guys can see it. What happened was there was a British soldier, enlisted soldier, and he was given the job of guarding the custom house. That's where they collect taxes. And so he was just one dude with his Brown Betts, or whatever they called their gun, their big gun that they had, their rifle. Now remember, those rifles, y'all, are not a rifle, it's a musket. You fire once, and then what do you have to do? You have to reload it. Pour the powder in, put the bullet in, ram it in, put, you know, a little bit of powder or a cap on your musket. It takes about 30 seconds if you're really, really fast. So a guy comes up and starts insulting him, right? And arguing with him, all this kind of stuff. Eventually, the British soldiers had enough, hits him with the rifle butt, okay? He goes down, he yells. Now, there have been a bunch of people hanging out in the taverns, getting their drink on and everything, and they then gather, and they begin to harass the one dude, okay? He calls out the main guard. Now, it's a very different world than today. If you and I yelled, people wouldn't hear us blocks away, right? Because we all have our TVs on, we got our music on. We got loud cars and airplanes. In those days, you could actually hear that. And so what happens, y'all, they're throwing snow. They've been throwing snowballs. They've been throwing rocks at this guy. And eventually Captain Preston brings around about 7 or so soldiers. They form kind of a thing. Now, he wants to get out of there, but the Americans have kind of cut off his exit. So it's a really delicate situation. And I got to say, y'all, our colonists weren't too bright because some of them start taunting the British. Now, important safety tip. Do not ever yell fire at somebody pointing a gun at you. I mean, it may seem like common sense, but these still were people yelling fire. And guess what? Somebody will fire. Now, what we think happened is one of the guys got knocked down, and he'd been one of them who'd applied for a job down at the docks and had gotten beat up because they didn't like the competition. So what happens is he gets knocked down. When I heard, he looked at the dude who beat him up at the dock the other day, and it was just too tempting, y'all. Busted a cap on him right there, literally, because they put caps on their things to fire. And that guy goes down. And I don't know if you've ever been in a massacre, but every massacre I've been in, once one person starts shooting, guess what? Everybody has to start shooting, okay? Now, what's interesting is there was, I think, only 7 shots fired, but 11 people got wounded. What do you think happened? Bullets maybe went right through people. Maybe there were ricochets. There's even a belief that maybe 2 bullets might have been put in the guns. So when they fired them, you got to remember these muskets aren't like rifles. They're not super accurate. They're kind of like spitwad shooters. The bullets just go like that when they come out. So it's possible that might have happened. But some of the wounds are just absolutely awful, okay? So I do happen to have rare historical footage here for y'all. Can somebody hit the lights back there?
A sentry,
Mr.
Private Hugh White,
Sherwood, please.
was guarding the customs house,
All right, here we go.
located here.
Rare historical footage. Now, this is filmed actually on
Around 8
site.
p.m., a young
Notice no
apprentice,
snow.
Edward Garrick, began to taunt White. The taunting continued until White struck Garrick with the butt of his musket. Garrick fell to the ground.
Down goes Garrett. Down goes Garrett.
Word of the incident swept through the town. A swarm of angry citizens descended on the square. Many of them had been
Now that's
drinking in the local
Crispus Attucks in
taverns.
front, right?
The angry crowd surrounded the sentry and threatened him with bodily harm. While the entire town appeared to be erupting, Captain Thomas Preston was in the main
You might be able to
barracks,
shoot one, but
across
after
the
that
street
it's over.
from the old state house, close enough to hear Sentry White call
75
for help.
yards away.
Captain Preston marched in with a small group of 6 privates and a corporal. The British rescue team reached White and attempted to escort him back to the barracks, but they were stopped by a mob of 200 to 300 angry citizens.
Wow.
Hemmed in
No,
by the
do
crowd,
not leave. Don't leave. Don't
Preston
let them go.
ordered his troops into a semicircle formation and took a position in front of his men. Several people in the crowd dared the soldiers to shoot, yelling "fire" over and over.
Not a good idea,
It
guys.
made the British soldiers feel like they didn't have any courage. You know, they're wanting to fire. They're wanting to answer that
Like
call,
it last
but they
week.
can't. And the crowd knows they can't, so they're daring them.
The ugly demonstration turned lethal when Patriot Richard Palm struck one of the soldiers, Private Hugh Montgomery, with a stick.
Yep.
Montgomery fell to the ground, then rose up and fired. Moments later, the Boston Massacre began. The other soldiers let loose with a fusillade of musket fire. 11 of the colonials fell.
Once they had fired, the mob retreated. So the soldiers reloaded their weapons, and as the mob had come back in to retrieve their wounded, the soldiers thought that the mob was advancing on them to do them harm. They leveled their muskets at the crowd as if to fire again. When Preston saw it, he immediately knocked up their muzzles, yelling, "Don't fire, stop, don't fire." Preston ordered the men into a column of 2s and then marched them back to the main guard.
Paul Revere, Samuel Adams, and other Patriot leaders quickly turned the violent confrontation into a massacre. a symbol of British tyranny, and demanded justice. Captain Preston claimed that the shootings had been a tragic accident, but it was to no avail. On March 13th, Preston and 6 of the 8 enlisted men were indicted for murder. The lawyer who defended the British soldiers was John Adams, ironically, the same man who would become America's second president.
And lead us into independence.
The trial hinged on one essential question. Had the British soldiers acted in self-defense, or did they commit murder?
All right, so what do y'all think? Should they be found guilty? Did they kill people, like, just cold-bloodedly, Dahmer style? What do you think? No, I mean, but they fired. I mean, who would you pick anybody particularly to go after? What about the captain? Did he do anything wrong? Did he order them to fire? He actually stopped him from firing on the second time. What about the first guy who fired? His self-defense. He got knocked down, right? The others, I don't know why they chose to fire. We do actually have trial testimony because it was a big trial. And the man who defended them, of course, obviously, was none other than John Adams here, right? Actual life size. Our diets have made us the big people we are today. But anyway, so there's John Adams, right? Now, Adams, I've read different things. I've read that he was ordered to defend him. I've also read that he wanted to defend him. He wanted to prove to them, y'all, that Americans could give a fair trial, that even though there were passions going up. In fact, y'all, there was a lynch mob. We didn't use the word lynch in those days yet, but there was a lynch mob of people that formed around where these men were kept in their quarters. They wanted to go drag them out and kill them. Fortunately, that didn't happen. Can you imagine the ramifications of that? Instead, they had a very fair trial. Now, anybody know what happened in the trial? Were they found guilty? No. 2 were, but not of murder. They were found guilty of manslaughter. What's the difference between manslaughter and murder? Murder is like what? On purpose, right? Murder is, it's a malice of forethought. Have you ever heard that term, malice of forethought? Be a good name for a band. I got to write that one down. But malice of forethought is, hey, what are you going to do today? Well, I'm planning on killing some colonials. You're thinking about it in advance. You go in intentionally doing it. Manslaughter is you do something stupid and your stupid action leads to somebody getting killed. Now, 2 of them were found guilty. I don't know how they figured it out. I can't remember if it was Hugh Montgomery or not. But they took their thumb and they had this small little thing that they heated in the stove, and then they burned an M on their thumbs. Why do you think they did that? Well, so for the rest of their life, anytime somebody shook their hands, anytime they had to write something, people were like, hey, dude, what'd you put the M in for? Oh, I killed some colonists. It was a type of punishment back then. And so for the rest of their lives, these men wore an M there. Now, the first person traditionally believed to have fallen was Crispus Attucks. He was half African-American, right, and half Indian. We think Wampanoag, Indians, the same ones that met the Pilgrims and stuff. The question is, was he a free man or was he an escaped slave? We don't know. There's a lot that we don't know about him, but he is, as you guys know, probably the most remembered. Most people can't name the other victims who were there. Even I have to kind of refresh my memory all the time. So he is seen as the first person to die for liberty. And if you guys have to write an essay about, different groups in the American Revolution, you would definitely want to mention Attucks. In fact, the first person or among the first persons to fall in the American Revolution was an African-American by the name of Crispus Attucks. We even have a school in Houston named after him, okay? Now, so it was pretty nasty. All right, so we're going to go on and, take you guys past that. So what happens as a result of this? Well, 2 Boston Sons of Liberty decide that they're going to use this for propaganda. And indeed, y'all, this is a classic example of propaganda. Now, people think propaganda means it's completely false. Completely false propaganda does not do very well, y'all. You have to have an essence of truth. You have to have a certain core of truth, and then you go crazy and twist it for your own political things. Did British soldiers kill Americans? Yeah, it happened, okay? But they're going to take it to a whole nother level in this classic example of propaganda, where you twist events for propaganda purposes. You're trying to influence opinion. There's like a whole museum of propaganda I think I went to in Florida once. But anyway, y'all, so Sam Adams, remember, the leader of the Sons of Liberty, he gets with Paul Revere, and he tells Paul Revere, hey, I want you to make a picture of the Boston Massacre. Paul Revere's like, dude, man, I wasn't even there. And he's like, don't worry, I'll tell you what to put on it. Now, that's the way I traditionally had been taught it. Now, this year in Academic Decathlon, one of our pieces is the Boston Massacre. And I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting. And I learned quite a bit about the picture. According to the Decathlon people, Paul Revere actually he plagiarized somebody else's picture. He just added a couple things on it. And the poor guy who originally did it, he didn't get any money. He got mad at Revere because Revere said, hey, can I borrow your picture there? I want to maybe do an engraving with it. He didn't think the dude would copy it completely, but apparently the guy did, and the guys didn't get any money or anything like that. Now, this picture will be called the Bloody Massacre. It will be engraved, which means they can print it, and they can send it over the whole colonies. They didn't have, it's just like today. If some outrage happened in America, somebody being beaten to death by a cop or something like that, or some terrible shooting, it would be sent to you and me on our phone. And man, our blood would get boiling. They didn't have phones, obviously, so instead they sent the picture to people. And of course, it's a very distorted picture. And people really got angry, okay? Like, have you read the actual story? No, but I've seen Paul Revere's drawing. And so they send prints to everybody. Now, we're going to look at the drawing, and they're going to tell you some things that are wrong about it from that same documentary. So here we go.
Trust Americans. Everything we know about the Boston Massacre is derived from this engraving. It was created by the famous patriot Paul Revere 5 years before his legendary midnight ride. The widely circulated picture depicts a small group of unarmed civilians being cut down by a volley of musket fire. This picture has been reprinted in countless history books and pamphlets and has been the defining image of the incident for over 200 years. But almost everything about this engraving is wrong. The shootings took place at night, not daytime. There was a thick layer of snow and ice on the ground, and the colonists were not the passive victims depicted in the engraving. There was a total of 9 British soldiers at the scene that night, not 8. And most importantly, the picture depicts the British Captain Preston standing behind his men.
What does it look like he's doing?
Here, Revere
he's ordering the firing, right?
British bias.
The witnesses, first of all, placed Preston in front of the soldiers to begin with. The soldiers are lined up very neatly as if they're firing in formation,
like
and as if they're being given a signal to fire by the commanding officer. This contradicts the witness testimony. This makes it look like a massacre.
We have very little information about the victims of this so-called massacre, but there is one person depicted in the engraving who has achieved a measure of fame, Crispus Attucks.
Crispus Attucks is probably the most well-remembered name from the Boston Massacre. He was popularly touted as the first Black American to die for the cause of freedom.
Attucks has gone down in history as the first victim to fall to the British guns, shot at point-blank range as he stood in front of the crowd. But is this what really happened? Even though he was immortalized as the most famous martyr of the Boston Massacre, we actually know very little about Crispus Attucks. Was he a hero or a propaganda invention?
Now, to me, that isn't that important. It's more what people believe is more important. They get into this whole thing about whether he was the first to fall or not. To me, he fell, he died, and that's the big thing. And all these guys are important. Now, let's see here. So the Boston lawyer, John Adams, defended him. I'm going to go through the picture with y'all in more detail. He wanted to prove to the British that, like I said, that we would give them a fair trial. And this is going to be particularly galling when later, y'all, the British pass what's called the Administration of Justice Act, and they make us send British soldiers back overseas or British officials anytime they get in trouble. And like I said, they convicted 2 of them of manslaughter, and they let them go. All right. Now, here is the engraving by Paul Revere, okay, or at least Paul Revere is giving credit. I guess you could say it's kind of revered in history. Sorry. And I've got my usual 25,000 close-ups of it there. Now they say, oh, look, it wasn't done at night. There's no snow on the ground. Okay, I'll give them that. I don't see any snow on the ground. Why didn't they put the snow on the ground? What might that allude people to or make people start thinking? What might it remind them that had happened? Snowballs, right? So no snowballs, no weapons to use against the British. It looks like these Americans are just standing around, minding their own business, and somebody starts shooting them. Don't you hate when that happens? Now, they say it's not nighttime. But what is that, a UFO or something? What is that? That's the moon. To me, he's saying it's nighttime. You know, if he does it all dark, it's going to be kind of hard to see stuff, right? And so to me, you know, I think that's a weak argument that person made. But there are a lot of errors. Now, one thing Revere did add that wasn't on the original is he put a name on this building. He called it the Butcher's Hall. And as far as I know, there really wasn't a butcher there. What's he doing by doing that? He's making you think of what? Butchery, British butchering them. You know, it's kind of an early subliminal message. Oh, Butcher Hall. That's probably where the British were staying, coming out to do the killing, okay? So let's look at some of this because I've studied this thing a lot over the years. Now, I don't know if Revere wrote it, and you do not write this down, but I do want to do a dramatic reading of... Hello? Hello? Okay, Ariana Rivera needs to go to attendance. Okay, thank you. All right, Ariana. Go to attendance. All right, need to talk to you. Take it, yeah, just in case. Just don't be gone long in case anybody else has an issue. All right, so at the bottom of the thing here, Revere, somebody else writes a poem. And I really should have written it in poem form, but I love this. It goes, unhappy Boston, see thy sons deploy, hallowed watts besmeared with guiltless gore, while Faithless and his savage bands with murderous rancor stretch their bloody hands like fierce barbarians grinning o'er their prey, approve the carnage and enjoy the day. If scalding drops from rage and anguish wrung, if speechless sorrows laboring for a tongue, or if the weeping world can aught appease, the plaintive ghost of victims such as these. Man, I need to make this into a rap. The patriots' copious tears for each are shed, a glorious tribute which embalms the dead. But no, fate summons to that awful goal, where justice strips the murderer and his soul. Should the venal, and I don't want to imagine what C-blank-T-S means, but it's a curse word, the scandal of the land, snatch the relentless villain from her hand. Keen execrations on this plate inscribed shall reach a judge who can never be bribed. Remember how we bribed a lot of their officials? And they figured the British would bribe our official and let these guys go. And of course, this happened before the trial. And then they list the names, Sam Maverick, James Caldwell, Crispus Attucks, and I forget the first guy's name, Gray. So anyway, here is your picture, y'all, that shows you the moon, okay, the buildings, you know, in the background as well. And of course, there's the Butcher's Hall that wasn't really there. And then here's the firing squad as such. Check out the looks on some of the British soldiers. What does it look like some of them are doing, y'all? They're grinning like, I've always wanted to do this, always wanted to do this. This is so awesome. And like this dude over here, he's like, I want to lean forward because I want my bullet to get there first, you know? he is just excited as could be. That's probably the dude that got knocked down and fired the first shot. I don't know. And definitely Preston here looks like he's ordering them to fire as if in a firing squad, right? Now, here are the innocent victims. And, I mean, they're just kind of standing around getting shot. I don't see any snowballs or stones or anything like that. Like, you know, this guy's kind of like, hey, stop it. And then check out the lady here, like, oh, the humanity, almost as if she's praying. Some people have compared her to sort of a Mary figure, like in the Christian church, like, you know, standing there that way. Lots of blood. People, even then, y'all, liked blood. And some of it's actually fairly accurate. One dude was shot in the head, and it did blow a hole big enough you could put your whole fist into the back where his head had been. Then you had a dude shot here, and it's just like kind of like a little fountain of blood coming out. But it's pouring all there. It looks like they're taking away a guy that might be Crispus Attucks there that they're carrying away. Not exactly sure. But, of course, you see that in it. Now, you guys haven't mentioned yet the one thing that almost all students pick up on. There's also what? Not a cat.
Dog.
A dog, but close, right? It's a dog. Everybody's like, Mr. D, there's a doggy in the picture. Hey, what is that little doggy doing in my massacre? Well, the dog, y'all, there was reports that a dog showed up, and you know dogs, y'all, they'll lick anything. And the dog started licking up the blood. So they don't have it doing it, but it's like, hey, isn't that the dog that, you know, yeah, it is. The dog that, yeah, you know. And so that's in there to kind of remind everybody that a dog did it. And here's just another picture of the firing squad, and you see them, and more of a close-up kind of some of the victims. Here's 1, 2, 3. There's at least 3 that look like they've been shot. There might be more. Okay. Oh, 1, 2, 3. Yeah, looks like this. Oh, is this one over here? Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe that's the 4, because 4 initially die, but I think 1 dies of his wounds. So we say he was mortally wounded or fatally wounded, and even more of a close-up. I could probably find a better copy and do that. Ooh, that came out awful. Pixelation like crazy. Now, it wasn't just this picture, which was great for people who couldn't read or write, but they wrote yards and yards of newspaper material. Now, you and I today, we want the news, we read it on our phone, we watch it on TV or whatever, right? These people were a lot more patient readers than we were. If you and I had a story this long, you know, you and I aren't like that. If I start reading the internet story and it goes on for more than a couple minutes, I'm like, scroll, you know. We're not very patient. These people didn't have any other source of information as far as news this way. And so it went through. Now, I did a project on this a few years ago, and I found some interesting stuff. Here we see one of the newspaper accounts last Thursday. Now, remember, in their printing, y'all, if you guys ever see F's in their printing, it's an S. If it looks like that, it's like a long S. I don't know why they did that, but I always have fun with that. And I go, oh, Boston, kind of thing. But last Thursday, agreeable to a general request of the inhabitants, by the consent of the parents and friends, were carried to their grave in succession. The bodies of Samuel Gray, Samuel Maverick, James Caldwell, and Crispus Attucks, the unhappy victims who fell in the bloody massacre of the Monday evening preceding! Exclamation point. And they go through and they describe the town's shops were closed. There was the church bells ringing, and it talks about them, you know, bringing this all through, and families following through, and you know, friends and all of that kind of stuff. Pretty strong stuff. Now, what I love is the picture of the dead. Now, of course, when you look at this, if there's somebody who couldn't read or read well, this was sort of like a quick message. Obviously, these are the coffins. And coffins in those days, y'all, the British still do it this way. They're made to fit your body, okay? They're not the big kind of rectangular boxes we have in this country. So they're kind of interesting that way. What do you think these letters are? Their names, their initials, right? SG, SM, JC, CA. Remember, one more was still to die, hadn't died yet. and of course, represent them as skulls. Now, what's weird is when you look at this, when you look at the teeth, what do you notice about the teeth? There's different numbers. Now, this dude only got 2 teeth. What do you think that's suggesting? What do you lose as you get older?
Teeth.
You lose teeth.
Oh.
They're older. This one has the most teeth. He also has A17 on his coffin. What do you think that means? He was 17 years old. Y'all's age, your age in a year. It was a young kid, Sam Maverick, okay, who was out there. And then here you see sort of a zoom in, not very good of it. Now, what is this object here? It's an hourglass. What is that traditionally used to mean? Like what? He ran out of time, or his time was cut short by this guy. So here, it's one of these things, y'all, right? It's a little kind of thing that you use to keep track of time. His time ran out. And what is this other thing? The scythe, right? It's the Grim Reapers. So kind of cool, right? So you don't even have to be able to read to get the main idea here. Like, oh my gosh, it was a 17-year-old boy. His life cut short, and then some old dudes, okay, also killed. All right, so you get that, and then here's more about it. When the other guy died, there's his, I think. They went ahead and added that to it. Patrick Carr, and they mentioned he died tonight, and that kind of thing. Now, I visited the graves a few years ago, and of course, I knew Crispus Attucks. And then notice Patrick Carr, because he died later. It's like, dude, you should have died when the rest of us did, but hey, we'll put you on here. Victims of the Boston Massacre, March 5th, 1770, were here interned by order of the town of Boston. And I go, okay. And then I kept reading. And I read this part. Here also lies buried the body of Christopher Snyder, aged 12 years old. And I'm like, how come I never heard of this kid? He's 12 years old, man. This is like an intermediate kid. Shot on George Washington's birthday, 1770, just 2 weeks before the Boston Massacre. So, of course, what did I have to do? Who the heck's Christopher Snyder? And so I looked him up on this cool invention. I believe it's going to be big someday. It's called the Internet. And on the Internet, or Wikipedia even, and what had happened, y'all, was they had been attacking, I think, some merchants or some officials' home, like they did, the Sons of Liberty. And this young kid decided to tag along, like, hey, all right, And so he tagged along. Well, the owner of the house decided, I'm going to stop these people. He came out with a rifle or gun, wasn't a rifle, but it was like a shotgun or musket. He fired one shot. Guess who was the lucky winner? Chris Snyder. And he died just 12 years old. So they went ahead and put him in there and said, this innocent first victim of the struggle between the colonist and crown, which resulted in independence. So anyway, y'all, I think that's just kind of interesting. This is where the marker is. I don't know those guys. This is a picture I got off the interwebs. But, here they are standing. And, you always want to go to the site of the massacre. But traffic is crazy, y'all. Bostonians drive like mad people. They have one hand on the steering wheel and the other to shoot. I'm seeing gestures at everybody. I mean, it's like honk, honk, and all that. They're absolutely wild. But my daughter and I were visiting, so we rushed out there. We stood on it, hopefully didn't get run over or anything, and then came back. And this is the actual spot. And it's been there, as you can see, a long, long time. That's the memorial to the victims of the Boston Massacre. So is it a little bit more complicated than y'all ever imagined? Yeah, I mean, is it just a simple story of, man, for some reason, just a bunch of colonists minding their own business, chilling, and British just for no reason just gun them down? It's much, much more complicated, as most things in history are, right? So I just kind of wanted to share that with y'all, folks. So each class kind of got to a little bit different spot. It seems like I go slower in the afternoon, or maybe I think of more stuff. Maybe I've got more participation. I don't know what it is. But I'm going to start at this point here with the sort of post-Boston Massacre results. Now, ironically, over across the ocean, the same day as the Boston Massacre is happening, of course, they don't know this is all going on, Lord North, the new prime minister, one of the king's friends, finally bows to the pressure from the merchants who had seen, as it says here, a 38% loss in their exports. And so once again, y'all, it's the economic pressure more than anything. So all of the the taxes under the Townshend Acts, the various Townshend Acts, are removed except for one, a symbolic one on the tax on tea. And this is basically done, as it says right here, that to prove that the British were still the boss, that the British Parliament still had the power to make laws. But it is that tea tax that's going to lead to one of the next events, the Boston Tea Party, of course. All right, now, let me move my picture here just a little bit. All right, so a very important thing to know, and Sam Adams, y'all, plays such an important role. Remember the guy, the bobblehead, right? Sam Adams here, for 3 years after the Boston Massacre, things calmed down. I mean, people were like, man, they shot people. It's getting real, right? And it really does kind of calm people down. Now, Sam Adams is worried that the fervor, the opposition to British rule is going to die away. So what he does is he creates, first in Massachusetts, and later it'll be copied across the country, what are called committees of correspondence. Now, they didn't have Facebook, obviously, back then, or Instagram, or whatever the newest type of social media is that you crazy young kids use. But the thing is, he decided to use writers, people that would, send information really, really quickly. So, really quickly, meaning it might take several weeks to get down to Charleston, South Carolina from Boston. But basically, he was sort of a clearinghouse for opposition to the British. So if he found out, hey, the British did something really nasty in New York, they did something bad in North Carolina, he would find out, and then he would remind the others. He's just kind of like an agitator, right? A professional agitator. His job was to egg on the colonists. So these were called committees of correspondence, and ultimately they went throughout all the colonies. So this is what happens during that calm period between 1770 and 1773. So the purpose is to warn the other colonies about various British incidents. It's there to broaden and maintain the resistance movement, as it says here, and it proved to be very, very effective. So once again, there is another contribution of Sam Adams, who really is indispensable to this revolution happening, or at least starting. So the Tea Act, y'all, this is, I think, one of the most misunderstood things. Most people say, oh, the British put a tax on tea, and the Americans didn't want to pay the tea tax, and so they threw all this tea into Boston. Like most things, the real story is a lot more complicated. The British East India Company, y'all, was a monopoly that had the only right to really sell tea in the colonies. Now, the trouble is, even with this monopoly, it was struggling and it was going bankrupt, right? It was running out of money. Why? Well, Americans, there was already a tea tax. Americans did not want to pay that tea tax. And also Americans preferred Dutch tea from what is today Indonesia. So this company is going bankrupt, even though, like I said, it had a monopoly on British tea imports. Now, the other thing is, this company had a lot of members of parliament who own shares in it. If it goes bankrupt, they're going to lose money. So they kind of hatched this interesting plan. What they decide to do is to sell tea directly to the colonials without the middlemen. Now, you guys probably know this, but you guys know if you go to Walmart and you see, I don't know, wrapping paper or something. Well, Walmart didn't make it. Walmart bought it from a distributor or from some company. So what happens is somebody makes the wrapping paper, then you sell it to a distributor. You make a slight profit there. The distributor sells it to Walmart, and they make a profit there, the distributor does, and then Walmart sells it to you and me, and they make a profit. The result is it ends up costing a lot more than it ever costs to make. But if you can cut out the middleman, if you can kind of cut out this distributor, what that means is you can lower the price. So the British come up with this idea. If we cut out the middleman, we can sell directly to the colonials, and we can still keep the tax on it, okay? We can still keep the tax on it, and even with the tax, it is still cheaper than it was before because we've cut out the middleman. It's going to be cheaper than the Dutch tea. Americans will buy it. So they really expected the colonials, y'all, to just choose the cheaper tea, regardless of the taxes. But to Americans, y'all, it was the principle of the thing. You know, we didn't want to pay the taxes. And that was the issue. So if you're ever arguing or trying to figure out, was this revolution about money, just cheap colonists not wanting to pay taxes, or was it about their rights as Englishmen? This is definitely something you could use to say, look, it was about the principle of the thing. It wasn't just a financial thing. All right, so we get the event of the Boston Tea Party, which is, if I move my face here, 1773, right? It happens then, so this is the end of that so-called calm period. Now, what you see here is Griffith Wharf, Wharf in Boston, and there were 3 British ships there. Now, after this tea, tax or whatever, tea law was announced, ships began to arrive, and in Philadelphia, in New York, the ships were turned back. But the governor of Massachusetts was adamant, right? He was stubborn that tax and the tea would land here in Boston. So the ships arrive. All right, so what happens? Well, these merchants, of course, a lot of them being the merchants, y'all, the distributors who got cut out of this, right? Remember, they're selling directly to the others, to the customers. Are very upset. Like we said, they turn them back in New York and Philadelphia. But in December of 1773, 60 Sons of Liberty, once again, this is a Sons of Liberty thing, organized by Sam Adams. Of course, it's going to be Sam, right? These guys decide, they meet at a place called the Green Dragon. It's a tavern that I believe is still in Boston. These guys go ashore. Now, they dressed as Mohawk Indians. I mean, this is the worst costume ever. Like blackface, yeah, kid you not, wearing blankets and stuff like that. And they go on board these 3 ships. They break open the lock, for which I understand they later paid for that lock. And then they threw this tea overboard, right? 342 cases of tea they threw overboard. Now, some Americans, y'all, got very, very upset about this because it was one thing to protest the British government, one thing to even attack representatives or officials of the British government. But this was targeting a private company. This was private property that they were targeting. A lot of Americans did not like the idea of them going after private property, and they thought this was going a little bit too far. So more conservative types were upset about the destruction of private property. Now, when this is all said and done, the colonists, some of them are nervous, some are excited, but the British, y'all, man, they go, you know what, they just go batty on this. And a professor from West Point that I had a class with one summer, he described it as if Massachusetts was that bad kid, the kid that was always getting in trouble in class. And by getting in trouble, making the teacher hate not just that kid, but hate the whole class. And eventually, what does that teacher do? They decide to punish everybody in the entire class. Like, okay, because of Joe, all of y'all are going to have homework this weekend. You're going to copy A in the encyclopedia. And, you and I hate that kid. I mean, I had that situation, and I hated teachers that punished me because of the actions of one or two. Well, this is what the British are going to do. They're going to punish Boston for the action. I mean, they're going to punish a lot of the colonies for the actions of Boston. They're going to punish all of Massachusetts for the actions of Boston. And I think the British really kind of thought this will cause Americans to separate themselves from Boston, to want to have nothing to do with them. But instead, the British go too far, and Boston becomes what we call a martyr. You have people around the country having moments of silence, people praying because Boston, is suffering so much under this. The West Point professor, he then went further and said, so that kid is causing trouble, and the teacher, the kids all hate that kid because it gets them in trouble. But one day the teacher has enough. The teacher pulls out a gun and bam, kills the kid. And everybody's like, holy, what the heck? You just killed a kid. Well, I got tired of them. And you and I, we would not want that, obviously, under any circumstances. And that's kind of how people felt, was that the British had used a sledgehammer to smash an ant or something, right? And in fact, Massachusetts gets a lot of support. Now, one of the things that comes up, and I've got a little bit more detail on the next slide, is a port bill is passed. This closes the port of Boston, except for medical and for food, basic foodstuffs, off. And you got to remember, y'all, Boston in those days was on a tiny little peninsula that kind of opened up. It was a sea city. You don't have stuff coming in, you're going to die. All right? They also passed what was called the Government Act. The purpose of the Government Act was to shut down the Massachusetts legislature and sort of put a British one, sort of a martial law kind of one in its place. They also increased the Quartering Act and imposed another Quartering Act because I guess they figured they were going to have more troops over here. And they passed the Administration of Justice Act. Now, why was this such a upsetting thing? Well, what this did, y'all, was allow British officials who were charged with some sort of crime not to be tried here in America, but to be taken overseas to England. Sort of like saying, hey, we don't trust you Americans to give these guys a free or fair trial. Even though we were really proud of what we had done in the Boston Massacre trial. We had let those guys off with their thumbs getting messed up. So it's sort of a sign of disrespect that we don't trust the American justice system. And that affected all the colonies, as did, I think, the Quartering Act. So here you see what this is going to lead to. This is the colonial response. The committees of correspondence, of course, let everybody know about this really quickly, especially what happened to Massachusetts. And this leads to the formation of the first Continental Congress. 56, I've also read 55 people show up from all the colonies, except for Georgia. Because you guys know, Georgia, the last colony, if Georgia sent like 2 delegates, that would be half their population. They meet in Philadelphia. You guys will see where in just a sec, to plan to respond to this. The first thing they form is an association. This association's job would be to yet again boycott British trade. They also adopt what are called the Suffolk Resolves, or Suffolk. Basically, they said these coercive acts, which the colonists now were calling intolerable, are unconstitutional. They tell Massachusetts, form your own government. Meet outside. Don't follow the instructions of that, government created there. Start collecting your own taxes, but even more, y'all, forms, get your militia, your private kind of armies to form. Start arming them, getting weapons, storing ammunition. And, as sort of it's not an olive branch because that's something later, but they write what's called a Declaration of Rights and Grievances. This is sort of the idea that, hey, the king's a good guy. The king just doesn't know what people are doing in his name. We're going to list our rights. We're going to list our grievances, the things that make us grieve and make us unhappy. And the king will fix that. And this is because our rights, our liberties as Englishmen have been violated. And we'll talk about those coming up here in a little bit. All right. Now, at the same time about that we get the intolerable or coercive acts, the British passed an act that we definitely overreact to. It's called the Quebec Act, okay? And sorry, this picture appeared and kind of blocked it there, but I can read what's on here for y'all. But what the British did was to extend the borders of Canada, or Quebec, because it was really the province of Quebec right here. This is where normally it goes, right? This is where it is today. It's kind of around the Great Lakes and all of that. Well, what they did, y'all, was they extended Canada all the way down to the Ohio River. What is today Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, half of Illinois, good chunk of Wisconsin was actually made into Canada. Now, this is land we had won in the French-Indian War. We saw as our land, and, hey, they first gave it to the Indians. Now they're giving it to the French Canadians. What's up? Everybody gets it but us. So this is one thing that aggravated them. But to take it even further, this land was claimed by Connecticut, New York, Massachusetts. But another thing is, in this new land and in Quebec up here, the Catholic Church would remain the established or state church. In other words, you paid taxes regardless of your faith to support that church. It was the favored church, and many of the colonists overreacted. And, to kind of understand it from their point of view, they've just had these intolerable acts put on them. They're really suspicious of anything the British do at this point. And so they began to really go down that slippery slope again, like, oh my gosh, like if they're going to make the Catholic Church like the state church here, pretty soon they're going to make it the state church of the entire colonies. Also, they allowed Quebec to keep having its appointed assembly. Once again, not an elected assembly like the colonies had, but a government appointed assembly. Oh my gosh, if they're going to do that to them, they're going to take away our elected assemblies. And then Canada, at least this part of Canada in those days, did not have trial by jury. They let them keep their no trial by jury. So, oh my gosh, they're going to take away our right to trial by jury in all the colonies. So the colonists really overreacted to it. And the thing is, why did they do this? Well, they wanted to maintain the loyalty of the French Canadians up here. They wanted to keep these guys on their side. And does it work? Yeah, because what ends up happening, y'all, is in 1776, Americans actually invaded Canada. Now, we thought we'd be greeted as liberators in Canada and free them, and the French Canadians would be thrilled to see us. They didn't help us. Instead, Benedict Arnold, then a patriot, and a guy by the name of Montgomery, they're beaten back. They failed to take Quebec, and they're driven back to America, to the colonies. And so the French Canadians did remain loyal. They remembered, hey, Brits are treating us pretty cool, man. They let us keep our assemblies. They let us keep our Catholicism. They let us keep our system. We're okay with them. And so it did work, but it angered the colonists, who really jumped to a conclusion here that they would lose all this stuff. All right, so this first Continental Congress meets 55 or 56 delegates from 12 different colonies. Remember, Georgia doesn't show up. This is where they meet, okay? This hall, the State House, or I'd heard one time Carpenter's Hall or whatever, but this becomes known, of course, as the place where the Declaration of Independence will be written, and eventually the Constitution will be written. Here's a picture of it. Of course, when I went to Philadelphia a few years to see it, it was closed for remodeling. Yeah, I always have that kind of luck. Or if I go to see some great painting, it's on tour, probably in Houston while I'm in the city where it's at, and I miss it. But anyway, y'all, so they show up there. Their thing is, how do we respond to the course of acts? How do we respond to the Quebec Act? And as we saw, they formed the association to keep the boycotts. They adopt the Suffolk Resolves, right? The Suffolk Resolves, and of course, to question the whole policy here, and they start telling people to arming themselves and forming militias and all of that. Now, I do want to mention this because this becomes an important thing later on. In a lot of these early colonial meetings, y'all, every colony, they might send 2, 3, 4 representatives, but they would only cast one vote. In other words, little Rhode Island had as much power as Virginia, the most populated state, or New York. And a lot of people think that's just not fair. Like, come on, that's not the way it is. Well, think of the United Nations. United Nations has very small countries, in population, very large ones. But in the General Assembly, they all have one vote. And once again, somebody like, man, how can like little Burkina Faso, how come it has so much power, the same as some of these others? But think about it. Would you join an organization that says, yeah, man, you're kind of small. You don't have many people. We're going to give you like a 1/5 of a vote or an 1/8 of a vote. And so the whole thing was basically saying we are all important. We are all equal. Now, when we adopt the Articles of Confederation, we're going to keep this. All colonies have one vote. They're all equal. When we write the Constitution, at least under the Virginia plan of Madison, it's going to be Madison wants you to have more representatives the more people you have. After all, he's from Virginia, right, where they got a lot of people. And the small states said, we're going to be voted out on everything. We won't have a chance. And so you end up getting this great compromise, our Connecticut compromise, that lets the House of Representatives be voted, have representatives based on the number of people in their states, including slaves. 3 out of every 5 slaves would be counted, and lets the Senate, which to this day remains equal. It doesn't matter if you're North Dakota with like 5 people living there, you got 2 senators, okay? Or if you're Texas or California, New York with like gazillions of people, you only get 2 senators. And it was a way, y'all, to reassure the small states. A lot of people don't like it. There are even people that would like to change it. But what they don't know is the one thing that cannot be changed in the Constitution without the approval of the people of that state is what's called equal suffrage in the Senate. A lot of these people that have these ideas, y'all, they just haven't read the Constitution. That would be very, very hard to change. But hey, weird things have happened, right? All right. So these guys meet, y'all, till October 26, 1774. They say, let's come back in about 6 months. Let's see what's going on and see how the king has responded to our declaration of our rights and our grievances. And a lot of people, y'all, you got to remember, most Americans did not want independence at this point. They wanted their rights as Englishmen. Only a handful of people, like maybe a Sam Adams or John Adams, was really thinking of a separate system, right? They wanted those rights as Englishmen. So this is going to be partially blocked here. I forgot to do to disappear here, but let's talk about your rights as an Englishman. Now, the most important document in British history, English history, and American history, as far as the basis of our rights, the taproot of our liberties, is this one right here, the Magna Carta. Here's a copy of it. I was lucky enough to actually get to see this when it went on tour and came to Houston a few years ago. Man, it was great. I got like a shirt, and everything like that. It was a great show. I mean, well, it was just got to see it. But still, so the Magna Carta was forced on King Charles in 1215. Not Charles, King John. King John needed money for a war. He was always having wars, and he wasn't too smart. He couldn't even really write anything like that. But anyway, they forced him to sign this. Like, look, and these were barons, these were wealthy Englishmen. They said, look, dude, if you want money, you're going to have to ask us, the representatives of the people. Of course, the people being the really rich Englishmen. They didn't have a system like we do yet. So anyway, they have 63 clauses in here. There are one that's shown up here that is very important. No taxes shall be imposed unless by common council of our kingdom. In other words, no taxation without representation, just in fancy words. By the way, the original was in Latin, eh? Now, the next one that comes up, no free man shall be taken or imprisoned, dispossessed of property, except by lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land. What does that mean? No trial, but by jury of your peers. This is trial by jury. 1215, y'all, that's why the colonists were so upset. This law had been theirs as an Englishman for 600 years at this, or 500 years and a half at this point, right? The other thing, too, is what today we call due process. We won't sell, we won't deny, we won't delay right or justice. Your right to a speedy trial, your right to due legal process. We just can't throw you in jail. Now, I'm going to go ahead and mention a couple other things here, and I'm going to make sure I hit all the points because I know I often write these notes up for you guys, and then I kind of get off track and stuff like that. And sometimes stuff gets a little out of order. Now, a few years later, and this isn't on your notes, but the British passed under King Charles I some of the rights that were, and added, you still had the Magna Carta rights, including some others. Once again, no taxation without consent of Parliament, no quartering of soldiers in private homes. That had been violated. That was 140 years old, that particular right. habeas corpus. Now, this is something Americans still honor, and it's a big deal. And we even put it in the Constitution, not just the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. What happens in some countries, y'all, is you get arrested, they throw you in jail, and they don't have a trial. They don't even have a hearing. You might remain there for months, even years. Habeas corpus literally means to present the body. So what that means is if you get arrested, and let's hope that never happens to any of you AP folks, but if you ever do get arrested, y'all, and they put you in jail, usually within 24 hours, they have to have a hearing. And the hearing, they have to charge you with something. They have to say, look, you're being held for this reason. If they can't come up with a reason, we let you out in 24 hours. You know, that is the thing. They have to come up with something. They must present the body. In other words, you must be presented to a judge. And so this was an important one. And also in 1689, just about 80 years before all this, the British had passed an act of toleration. Now, it was somewhat limiting. Catholics still did not have full freedom, but your Congregationalists, as we called the Puritan and Pilgrim Church here. So these are a lot of the rights that you and I think are quintessentially American. They go back to the British, y'all, and this is what Americans wanted when the war starts. They're not fighting for independence yet. It's going to take Adams and Thomas Paine and others to convince them of that. They just want the rights that they feel like as Englishmen, right? Because they're Englishmen still have, okay? So you see that by your picture there. Now, as I'm looking down here, this is where I've got the stuff about the intolerable acts, and I apologize for it being there. But of course, you know, the body is the Continental Congress. Its plan, of course, was to have this these boycotts, right, to not buy British stuff. That had worked well. Women, as always, were often the enforcers of this boycott. That's a key role that women play. So those are the things there on page 5. Now, I guess I don't have that picture of Patrick Henry here, so I left out a little bit here. So let me just go ahead and talk about this guy with you guys for a little bit. Oh, here he is. He's up at the top. Boy, man, Mr. D, you got this stuff mixed up all over the place. So go back up on top of that picture of the taproot of freedoms. Who is this Virginian patriot to the right? Third question I've got to ask for you. That is Patrick Henry, okay? Here you see the picture that I have there for you. Now, Patrick Henry was quite, he would later be an opponent of the Constitution, one of the anti-federalists. And in this document here, he gives a very, very impassioned speech, part of which most Americans should know at least the last words here. So he says, let us not deceive ourselves longer. We have done everything that could be done to avert the storm, which is now coming on. We have petitioned. We have remonstrated. We have supplicated. We have prostrated ourselves. And this guy was a great speaker, y'all. When he said prostrated, he bows and everything. Our petitions have been slighted and we have been spurned. Now, if there was just a cartoon that I knew, if there'd been maybe a TV show made for young kids that had this, it would be pretty awesome. And then he closes with those famous words, gentlemen, we may cry peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from the north will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. And he says, our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? There you see them making that comparison again. And at this point, y'all, he literally acted as if he were shackled. And he says, forbid it, Almighty God. And this is the line you need to know. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. And that's literally what he did. He did like he'd been stabbed or something. Remember, this is the guy who threatened George III with, the fate of Caesar and of Charles I. So let's see, is there any kind of...
Mr. Patrick Henry.
Oh my gosh. Got a cartoon here.
Before the House is one of awful moment to this country. For my own part, I consider it as nothing less than a question of freedom or slavery. There is no longer any room for hope. If we wish to be free, if we mean to preserve those privileges for which we have been so long contending, we must fight. I repeat it, sirs, we must fight.
There's the Old North Bridge
And
at
appeal to
Concord.
arms and to the God of hosts is all that is left us. They tell us we are weak, unable to cope with so formidable an adversary. But when shall we be stronger? Will it be next week or next year? We are not weak. We are 3 million people armed in a holy cause of liberty. Gentlemen may cry, peace.
Here we go.
Peace. But there is no peace. The war is actually begun. The next gale that sweeps from Boston will bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it.
I know not course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or death. I don't know how that part got cut off there. I like my impression better. Right. That was the great Michael Douglas, right, actor, married to Catherine Zeta-Jones. All right, now, we do have friends in Parliament, and this is going to be one reason, y'all. In the Declaration, we specifically attack the abuses by the king. We don't really call out Parliament because we have friends in Parliament. Good old William Pitt, remember him from the French Indian War? Edmund Burke, a great conservative thinker. These guys believed, too, that Americans were just safeguarding their liberties as Englishmen, the same ones that we had there. They wanted the course of acts upheld. Once again, English merchants are up, being hurt by this boycott. But Lord North, the prime minister, the king's friends, the king's men, they told the king not to do it. And so as a result, in November 1774, he basically declares New England to be in a state of rebellion. And those famous words, blows must decide whether they are to be subject to this country or independent. In other words, we gotta lay it down. We gotta let them know you're our subjects. We're your parents. You guys are the kids. All right. So go back, y'all, down to the bottom of page 5 here. And we see General Gage, the march on Lexington and Concord. This happens over the night of April 18th and 19th. Now, General Gage, bless his heart, he didn't want to be in this position. He liked Americans. He married an American woman. And he didn't intend a war. He wanted to stop a rebellion or a revolution. So he comes up with a plan to nip it in the bud. What he's going to do is he's going to go to Concord, where he's heard that they're storing ammunition. He is going to arrest Hancock, John Hancock, and Sam Adams. He sees them quite rightly as the leaders of this rebellion. If he can arrest them, Sam Adams, John Hancock, he can do it. Now, he hopes to do this in secret, okay? But he tells his wife. And many historians believe today his wife, who, as I said, was American and pro-patriot, she is going to share that information. So the supposedly secret raid, we're going to know when it's happening. So about 10 p.m. at night, Francis Smith and Major Pitcairn, are going to take about 700 soldiers from Boston here. Now, they're going to go by sea, right? Rather than go this way and go all the way through there. They're going to go by sea through Cambridge, where Harvard is today, make their way through Lexington, and get to Concord. It's about a 20-mile hike, right? Quite a long thing to do. And, of course, along the way, the Redcoats were singing a song, making fun of Americans, Yankee Doodle Dandy, right? Making fun of us, thinking we could not fight. So he hopes to nip all this in the bud. But like I said, his wife gets information out and to the colonists and lets them know, we think it was her, or at least somebody did, that the British were coming, so to speak, or at least the British Army was coming. Now, what they do is to let the Americans, to let the colonists know, are they coming by land? Are they coming by sea? They came up with an idea. If the British were coming by land, the soldiers, they would hang one lamp up in the church steeple. In those days, y'all, no buildings were taller than church steeples. So they put it up there in the bell tower. I said steeple, but the bell tower. And they put two up there, which meant the British were coming by sea. They didn't have the air option, I guess, back then. Now, three men, William Dawes and Paul Revere, the most famous. Revere has become famous, y'all, because of the poem by Longfellow. He wasn't really that well known in his life for it, but when Longfellow writes this poem, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere," you know, it just doesn't work too well with Dawes. Dawes got a statue, by the way, a few years ago out by Harvard. But anyway, so their job is to go out there and warn Hancock and Adams and also get Americans ready. Now, he didn't yell the British are coming because, of course, we were British. So he probably yelled the lobster backs, the British regulars are coming, the regulars, the army, or whatever. Because to say the British were coming, like, but we're British, you know? So, yeah, here you see him going, right? Well, go, Paul. You're doing great. Keep on going, all right? And so they warn them. Now, the next thing that comes up here, y'all, is 700 men show up. The British have, like I said, 700 men or so. I mean,
from Boston, the commander of the British forces in America, General Thomas Gage, dispatched 800 redcoats to the town of Concord to snuff out this insurrection before it could begin.
Having received intelligence that ammunition, artillery, and small arms had been collected for the authority purpose of raising rebellion against His Majesty, you will march to Concord, where you will seize and destroy all military stores whatever.
Before the order reached British soldiers, it was passed to American spies, who set in motion an elaborate series of alarms to warn the countryside. Shortly after 10 p.m., 2 lanterns glowed briefly in the steeple of Boston's Old North Church, just long enough to signal patriots across the Charles River that the redcoats would move that night by water. The official courier of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, a 40-year-old silversmith named Paul Revere, received urgent orders from Joseph Warren, the head of rebel intelligence.
About 10 o'clock, Dr. Warren begged that I would immediately set off for Lexington. 2 friends rowed me across the Charles River. They landed me on the Charlestown side, went on to the town, and there got a horse. The moon shone bright.
Around midnight, Revere reached the small town of Lexington and shouted, "The regulars are coming."
Paul Revere didn't say the British are coming because the colonists regarded themselves as British. They were British citizens who lived in America, but they were certainly British citizens. So Revere and the other dispatch riders said the regulars are coming, or the redcoats are coming.
The town bell rang, and for as far as it could be heard, young man and old pulled
just like their Instagram, right? You ring the church bells, they knew to come in the middle of the night.
In the chill night, 130 militiamen stood at the ready for an hour, but it seemed the alarm might be false. Captain John Parker had sent scouts to locate the redcoats, but not one had returned. Parker released the men to wait for the next call of the drum. Up to 30 withdrew to nearby Buckman Tavern.
Started getting their drink on.
There's always a sort of a loaded situation when you're sitting in a tavern all night. I'm not sure Buckman Tavern.
They got loaded. I mean, sorry.
That they were going to have a major war on their hands. I think they were intent on showing the British that they were serious.
Out on the road, the regulars were being driven hard, a mile every 16 minutes. Their officers
Pretty
feared
fast-paced.
daybreak and detection. Inside some of the houses they passed, men and women were wide awake, melting pewter dishes into musket balls.
Yep.
Inside Buckman Tavern, all was quiet. At about 4:30, a scout returned with news. The redcoats were indeed coming. They were less than half a mile down the road. Three British companies, about 100 men, reached a crossroad. A hot-blooded young lieutenant had to choose between taking his men toward Concord, where he had been told to go, or into Lexington, where he could see armed Americans waiting. With his superiors out of earshot, Lieutenant Jesse Adair made his fateful choice. At 5 o'clock on the morning of April 19th, he led his men toward Lexington Green.
Remember, Green is like a common area between the
Parker
houses.
gathered his men, now fewer than 80, and gave his orders.
Stand your ground. Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here.
No one knew what would happen when the two forces collided. And certainly no colonial commander wanted to give the order to fire. If they fired on British regulars, they could be tried for treason. And the punishment for committing treason was the most hideous punishments. They were hanged, their arms were cut off, their legs were cut off, they were disemboweled. It was a very slow,
Drawing and
painful
quartering.
death.
Always
So
a
no
fun
one
time.
wanted to give that order.
The militia heard British Major John Pitcairn yell, "Lay down your arms," and another officer shout, "You rebels, disperse! Damn you, disperse!" Outnumbered, Captain Parker told his men to abandon the Green. Then, from somewhere, a shot rang out. There is no saying who fired it, rebel or redcoat. But in that puff of smoke, the bond of kinship between England and America was severed.
This is a revolutionary situation in which literally everything changes, not merely in the course of a single day, but almost in the course of a single minute. Long as it takes to fire the guns and the soldiers drop dead, everything has changed.
In the chaos, the British charged forward, blindly thrusting their bayonets and ignoring their officers' shouts to fall in.
Gets out of hand, out of control real quick.
Last, the drums brought the redcoats back into ranks, and their officers marched them the way they were supposed to have gone in the first place, toward Concord. The British took stock and found they had only one man wounded, a private shot in the thigh. For the families in Lexington, the toll was unthinkable. 8 men lay dead. 9 more were wounded.
Okay, so as you just guys saw in that awesome video, the American Revolution begins with a skirmish. I'm not going to call it a battle at Lexington on April 19th in the early morning. Paul Revere had warned these folks that eventually about 75 men under John Parker will meet them on Lexington Green or Lexington Commons. And he yells, "Disperse your rebels, lay down your arms, go home," right? And then, of course, Parker's famous for saying, "Stand your ground, don't fire upon, but if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." And that, of course, as that guy said, changes everything. And it'll be known as the shot heard around the world. Now, it'd have to be pretty loud to be heard around the world. But that comes, of course, from a famous poem written by Ralph Waldo Emerson. And what does it mean to say it was heard around the world? It means it shocked the world. It changed the world. One of the things AP wants you guys especially to know is that the American Revolution is going to inspire, well, less than great revolutions like the French Revolution, but it's going to inspire revolutions in Haiti. It's going to inspire revolutions in Central America under Simón de Bolívar, right? The Mexico Revolution or Mexican Revolution. And so that's what we mean of that, okay? Now, the next page here. The battle, after defeating the colonists at Lexington, the British then continue their march on to Concord. Now, at Concord, there is a real battle. I'll go ahead and let you see the video. I'll have to cue it up here for y'all to see that part. Okay. Here we go. There's another scene from it, and I'll take you guys over to that part where you can see what happened at the North Bridge.
And the thigh. For the families in Lexington, the toll was unthinkable. 8 men lay dead. 9 more were wounded. Among the survivors, shock gave way to rage. They shouldered their muskets and set off toward Concord to vent their grief in British blood.
Now, this battle will be completely different. America will end up winning this one. You'll see some actual scenes of the old North Bridge where they fought.
Paul Revere never finished his midnight ride.
Yeah.
Just after 1 a.m., he was captured by a British patrol. But the alarm was carried to Concord by a local physician, Samuel Prescott, who had been recruited by Revere less than an hour earlier. As day broke on April 19th, virtually every town within 20 miles had been alerted that the Redcoats were coming.
And they're all going to head to Concord.
By 8 a.m., the British reached Concord to search for rebel arms. All they could find were 3 cannon, 60 casks of flour, and 500 pounds of musket balls.
They went door to door asking politely. There it is, the old North Bridge.
A mile and a half north of Concord, about 100 Redcoats were holding a small bridge. On a hill above them, 400 angry militiamen gathered and waited. The Concord militia was being steadily reinforced by men from neighboring Acton, Bedford,
like Ord Acton,
Carlisle. Yet they made no move until they saw smoke billowing over the town.
Yep.
The British were burning the few armaments they had found.
This is a guy's paintings by the name of Doolittle who was there actually and did these paintings.
They advanced on the North Bridge. Minuteman Amos Barrett reported he was within 15 rods of the Redcoats, about 80 yards, when they opened fire.
They fired 3 guns, one after the other. I see the ball striking the river on the right of me. That ball's whistled well.
Militia Major John Buttrick shouted, "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire!" In the exchange, 2 militiamen were killed. 4 of 8 British officers were wounded. 3 enlisted men fell dead. And the King's troops fell back.
Now, what will happen then is they will make their way back, as you guys will see here. So, I'm going to play a little video from you from Schoolhouse Rock. I had to endure it, so do you.
Set the nation on its ear, and the shot at Lexington heard round the world. When the British fired in the early dawn. Independence had begun. The die was cast, the rebel flag unfurled.
Sorry, that was too loud.
And on to Concord marched the foe to seize the arsenal. There, you know, waiting folks, searching all around. Till our militia stopped them in their tracks. At the old North Bridge, we turned them back and chased those redcoats back to Boston town.
This is how Mr. D learned history.
And shot around the world. the start of the revolution. The Minutemen were ready on the move. Take your powder, take your gun, report to General Washington. Hurry, men, there's not an hour to lose. Now at famous Bunker Hill, even though we lost, it was quite a thrill. The rebel Colonel Prescott proved he was wise. Outnumbered and low on ammunition as the British stormed his position. He said, hold your fire till you see the whites of their eyes. Though the next few years were rough, General Washington's men proved they were tough. Those hungry, ragged boys would not be beat. One night they crossed the Delaware, surprised the Hessians in their lair, and at Valley Forge they just bundled up their feet. Now the shot heard round the world was the start of the revolution. The men were ready on the move. Take your blanket, take your sons, report to General Washington. We got our rights and now it's time to prove. Well, they showed such determination that they won the admiration of countries across the sea like France and Spain, who loaned the colony ships and guns and put the British on the run and the Continental Army on its feet again. And though they lost some battles too, the Americans swore they'd see it through. Their raiding parties stepped up, hit and run. At Yorktown, the British could not retreat, bottled up by Washington and the French fleet. Cornwallis surrendered, and finally we had won. The shot heard round the world. The end of the revolution. The Continental rabble took the day. And the father of our country beat the British there at Yorktown. Brought freedom to you and me and the USA. God bless America. Let freedom ring.
Woo, yay. Yep, that's how I learned history. Wow. But hey, it got a lot of the stuff there. I'm sure you guys probably fast forwarded through it, but hey, whatever. So what happens on the way back? This is the top of page 6. So after losing at Concord at the North Bridge there, the British flee back to Boston. It's a good, 20 miles or so. And along the whole way, colonists were shooting at them from trees, from behind fences. There were various skirmishes on the way. And of course, as you guys learned from the Schlesinger video, the colonists used these Indian-style, what we would later call guerrilla tactics, fighting from behind there, making hit-run attacks. And of course, this time it was the Yankees making fun of the British using the song the British had used to make fun of the Americans. The song was Yankee Doodle. And of course, it becomes a theme song of it. Yankee Doodle indeed. Keep it up. Yankee Doodle dandy. So before it's all over, the British have lost quite a few men in this day. It doesn't seem like many today. I think it was like 125 dead, several hundred wounded. And they make their way back into Boston, where a siege begins. Now, 16,000 militiamen from all over New England will surround Boston. Gage's redcoats will be trapped there for 11 months until finally they evacuate in of March of 1776. So you guys can see here kind of how Boston used to be kind of on this thin little kind of peninsula. I think a lot of this area has been filled in now. It's not quite as distinctive as that. But anyway, so Boston goes under siege. Now, in May, if you guys remember, the First Continental Congress had said the Second Continental Congress would meet. Well, they show back up May 10th, and what has happened? There's a revolution on. Blood has been shed. But they do make one last attempt. This will be known as the Olive Branch Petition by Joseph Galloway. Joseph Galloway and quite a few Continentals still wanted to fix the thing. I mean, it's like, the marriage ain't working, so you're trying to get counseling, right? Let's go one more time, honey. This time it'll work. Let's get back together. And so they offer sort of a system here where they'll have a president that's selected by the king, and there'll be various elected officials and representatives by the colonies, sort of America operating as sort of a state, but a semi-independent state of Great Britain. Of course, the king will have none of this. And but it is one last attempt. You guys, of course, know an olive branch is something you offer to somebody that you've been fighting with or arguing with as a hope to solve it, right? I know you guys know that term. All right, now, if you guys turn to page 139 of your comic book, I'm going to go ahead and hopefully, let's see if I can get the camera back on here. Yeah. Okay, 139, you guys will find in that handout I gave you a list of the two sides of the forces. Actually, 140 is the one that has advantages and disadvantages. Yeah, it's page 140 right behind it. And I know you probably can't see it on here. You definitely wouldn't be able to see it in class. But I do want you guys to read through these and to look at, say, the British versus the Americans. And, you know, look at the advantages that each has. Look at the disadvantages that each have. And of course, somebody's advantage, say the British, is the disadvantage of the Americans and vice versa. But, you know, the British had the Indians. They had a lot more men and they were better trained. They had more money. They had Hessian mercenaries, these soldiers that are hired to fight that came from Hesse in Germany, or what is today Germany. But, of course, a big, big difference. The British aren't fighting for a cause, right? They aren't like the Americans fighting for their freedom. Their officers, after a battle called Bunker Hill, aren't going to press the advantage. Generals like General Howe many times had the colonists on the run, and had they just pressed on one more afternoon or evening, they might have been able to take Washington and end it. This is also going to be a big problem, the distance from their home base, a long, long supply line. You guys have heard a lot about supply chains. Well, imagine 6 weeks to let them know you needed something and 6 weeks for it to get over there. They also had a very, very large coastline, America did, that made it hard for the British to try to blockade them. And of course, there was always that threat that Britain, who had made a lot of enemies, can you say the French, can you say the Spanish, America would be able to get people to help them. And indeed they did, and that turned to be the turning point. The British had nobody of the character, at least, of Washington. Yeah, he makes mistakes. The Americans have more motivation. They know their territory. They're playing on their home ground. Some experienced officers and a few Americans will have this American or Kentucky rifle that was much more accurate. It was slow to load, but it was much, much more accurate. Now, of course, a lot of our soldiers are inexperienced. They're fairly young. They weren't trained for very much. And when they enlisted, when they joined, they only joined for a season to a year. We had basically no Navy except what the French gave us. We would use instead privateers. These were ships that were basically, you were given permission to be Jack Sparrow, to be a pirate. We never had enough money, and Congress never gave enough money. So they printed a lot of paper money that was called continentals. There was even a phrase back in the day, y'all, called, that ain't worth the continental, meaning it ain't worth you know what. And of course, they had to fight loyalist people who were too fighting for a cause, fighting on their own ground. So I do want you guys to look at that, and in your mind, tell me what you think were probably the greatest advantages the Brits and the Americans had, and why, and what you think the greatest disadvantages the Americans and the Brits had, and why you think those were. Pick two of them. Now, when you guys go back to page, let's see, is it up above that? Page 139, let's see here, Mr. D. Yeah, I think if you go back to page 139, you'll see what we call the balance of forces here, where we compare the size of the American armies to the size of the British Army here, okay? And look at those numbers, kind of compare them. And I want you guys to kind of write just a sentence or two comparing the differences in size and the composition, who is in those different groups. You'll notice, for example, that African Americans served on both sides, right? And notice who Native Americans tended to pick, and look at some of those things. It's just good to know that. Now, the next thing is, I'll ask you, what do you think is the greatest disparity out here? What's the one that will hurt the Americans the most? So if you're a betting man or woman, betting person, I guess, what do you think the odds are they're going to win? You mean, don't say, well, we win. I know we win. Well, of course you know we win. But look at it at the beginning. You don't know that the French are going to help. You don't know that the Spanish are going to help. Do you think we stand a snowball's chance in HE double hockey stick in winning this thing? So give me some odds. Justify why you think those odds are the same. And then, of course, I have a few questions here. Who are mercenaries? Where did George III find them? Think about their motivation, why they're fighting. And then I want you to look at least at what they say the fractions of Americans could be called patriots or patriots as they pronounced it then, or Whigs. What fraction of Americans could be called Tories or loyalists to the British? And then finally, what do you think, if it was a third and a third, what do you think the other third were? So with this, y'all, we got the revolution on like Donkey Kong. And I want you guys to be thinking about that. I'll be getting you guys a video over the revolution itself. I hate to kind of rush through it, but, you know, we are on a time limit thing. I'm already behind. I'm always behind, but I'm less behind than usual. So I'm making progress. All right. I'll leave you guys there. Thank you for your attention. Take care.